A careful reader will notice, in the scene known as Auerbach's Cellar, a striking shift in the movement of the poem. It appears, and indeed truly does, move from an inward realm of thought into an outward realm of action. The hero leaves behind the confined, oppressive study and steps into the open, expansive horizon of life, now driven by new purposes and entering a new field of effort. What does this transition signify? How does it connect to the work as a whole? What does it contain? These questions invite a brief, explanatory introduction. At this moment, one encounters a structural turning point in the entire work, a living junction in its poetic form that must not only be felt but also understood. Here, the first part of the narrative closes one of its principal divisions and opens another. The earlier division has followed the inner experience of Faust, particularly his engagement with denial, from which Mephisto has arisen and now appears as a concrete presence in the world. This internal struggle has been severe, but now it shifts outward. It becomes an external conflict. Faust's struggle with the world and with the devil as an active force within it. The world he now enters contains a devil, just as Faust himself has harbored one. The man who carries Mephisto within is drawn into a realm where Mephisto also exists externally. Naturally, the two are united through this shared element, with Mephisto assuming the role of guide. This Mephistophelian realm presents itself as a tangible reality, visible and demonstrable to all. It may be imagined that the devil formed this domain at the moment he escaped from Faust's inner being, perhaps when the inner boundary was broken. In any case, this realm exists, and the task is to recognize and define it. From this point forward, Faust moves within a sphere entirely different from the one he previously inhabited. It is worth pausing to examine the foundation of this significant transformation. Denial, as has been shown, has taken on a real form and thereby achieved reality. It is no longer confined within the mind, but has become a demonic force or agent possessing its own domain. Denial must oppose something that exists. It cannot remain enclosed in thought without losing meaning and substance. Yet the process is revealing. In denying existence, denial itself comes into existence. In destroying one world, it creates another. Mephisto is not merely a figure who rejects everything. He is an active creator who builds a world upon his negation. Earlier, he appeared as a theoretical denier in scholarly form, but he quickly transformed into one who caters to the senses. This change demonstrates that denial, once put into practice, abandons theory and turns toward satisfying desires. Having emerged from the mind into lived reality, Mephisto establishes his practical denial as a domain of sensual indulgence. The unfolding of this process now becomes evident. The world of reality, as understood here, contains two elements, the sensory and the spiritual. The senses are an essential part of human nature and must not be suppressed or mistreated through extreme restraint. They deserve their rightful place. Yet their higher purpose lies in being elevated into the spiritual. They are meant to carry and express an unseen spiritual dimension. This spiritual dimension is not an abstract invention of thinkers or dreamers. It is a fundamental reality of human life. It takes form in what is commonly called the world of institutions, which possesses a solid and independent existence. These institutions exist to enable a rational life, not merely a life governed by sensation. They represent the transformation of sensory experience and sustain not only the body but also the spiritual nature. If, however, a person enters this world of institutions convinced that there is no truth and no spiritual reality, that person must reject their rational foundation and remain confined to their sensory aspect alone. This reflects the Mephistophelian element within institutions, corresponding to the same element within the individual. Acting upon such a negative conviction, one begins to dismantle the rational structure of institutions and replaces it with a new order built solely upon sensory experience. This is the world that now comes into view, emerging from denial in opposition to rational institutions. It may be called the diabolical or the perverted world, for it represents a profound distortion of the senses, overturning reason and revealing the domain of Mephisto. In this realm, Indulgence rather than restraint of desires and passions forms the basis of organized life. This perverted world already exists in some form and functions effectively. Into it Faust must inevitably be led, carrying within himself that same demonic element. Indeed, he is compelled toward it and, in a sense, participates in its creation. As for guidance, there is no need to search far. The guide is already present and prepared to act, Mephisto himself. He will lead Faust to experience both the smaller and the larger world, whose general nature can now be understood. These realms will not reveal the rational or spiritual essence of reality, nor the positive institutions shaped by human spirit. They will not display the ethical structure of society. Instead, they will represent the negation of all such elements. Mephisto, as embodied denial, has transformed his negation into active reality. He is no longer a figure of abstract doubt or intellectual negation, but a force of practical denial operating within the world as an independent power. In other words, he has moved from subjectivity to objectivity. This negative spirit no longer remains a mere expression of thought or speech. It organizes its own domain, forming a kind of institution, yet one fundamentally opposed to all true institutions. This negative institutional domain, referred to as the perverted world, is now presented through three principal stages, each embodied in a distinct scene. These scenes are Auerbach's Cellar, the Witch's Kitchen, and Walpurgis Night. Though unusual and distorted in character, such places do in fact exist within society, yet they stand opposed to its ethical purpose. They represent organized structures set against true institutions, forming precisely the kind of realm that Mephisto has established for his own triumph, and into which he intends to guide Faust as he begins a new path. All of these scenes rest upon the indulgence of appetites or the pursuit of individual aims such as ambition, fame, or gain. The universal purpose of life is entirely denied. In each case, the rational aim of existence dissolves into a festival of the senses and of self-centered pursuits. Built upon the absence of rational direction, what appears is a kind of society, or rather a world, that has lost its equilibrium, as though it had been overturned in its cosmic course, with top and bottom reversed, continuing its motion through time in that disordered condition. Within these scenes, life assumes the character of an orgy, for without rational purpose it can become nothing else when surrendered entirely to appetite. This explains the peculiar form in which they are depicted, a literary mode that may be described as orgiastic, portraying a realm of revelry where the serious aim of life has disappeared. When deprived of reason, existence must appear irrational and take on that very shape. Just as an individual behaves irrationally when reason is lost, here it is not merely a person but an entire world that has descended into madness, stripped of its rational element and abandoned to absurd actions. To depict such a perverted world, a correspondingly distorted form is required in order to convey the truth. This represents a bold artistic effort, yet it is necessary if the theme is to be fully developed. There is undoubtedly nonsense within this portrayal, yet within that nonsense lies meaning, and beyond that, a necessity for such an apparently irrational expression arising from the subject itself. Earlier, the narrative followed a developmental form that produced Mephisto as the ruling force within Faust's world. Now it also gives rise to this orgiastic form, consistent with the overall progression. Nor does this approach depart from reality. Human beings, when given over to excess, commit actions that are senseless because reason no longer governs them. Still, this depiction does not present nature in its most crude and direct form, as can be found in certain dramatic works. Instead, its harshest elements are concealed within a subtle symbolism. This symbolism places considerable demands upon the reader, while also assuming a capacity for deeper perception, the ability to discern meaning within apparent nonsense, to recognize the method within madness and the clarity within confusion. This portion of the work is particularly challenging, and has not yet been fully grasped by many interpreters, nor has this literary form been widely recognized or understood. Attention may now turn to the structure of the perverted world as it is developed. As already noted, this world arises when rational purpose is subordinated to appetite or personal desire. Once reason loses its governing role, the entire order becomes distorted. The first stage, illustrated in Auerbach's Cellar, may be described as the perverted tavern. Taverns, in themselves, have a legitimate place within society, yet this one clearly occupies a corrupted position and contributes to social distortion. Eating and drinking are necessary aspects of human life, and their proper function is to sustain it. However, the purpose of life is not merely to maintain these acts. When they become ends in themselves and are pursued as the ultimate goal of human effort, their proper relation is reversed, and human nature is degraded. In this scene, a group of individuals is entirely absorbed in satisfying a single appetite, the desire for drink, and they are immersed in it. Behind them stands a broader organized interest that supports and encourages this inclination, including those who produce and supply such indulgence, building upon it a kind of system. Into this environment Mephisto leads Faust, offering him an experience of a world shaped by such impulses. Yet Faust, still retaining his earlier striving, finds little satisfaction in it, and thus the movement quickly advances to the next stage. The second stage of the perverted world appears within the family, an institution that contains both a rational and a sensuous side, and can therefore be distorted by Mephisto in a manner similar to what has already been shown. The most immediate form of physical appetite is that which sustains the human body through food and drink. When this appetite becomes the sole aim of life, it sinks into a bestial condition, as has already been observed in the perverted tavern. The next form of physical appetite concerns the continuation of the human race. One impulse drives a person toward self-preservation, while the other directs toward reproduction. When the sexual element is governed by reason and transformed into an ethical relation between man and woman, it gives rise to the true family. Yet when this proper order is reversed, the institution becomes its opposite. The two aspects of the family in its descent into distortion are presented through two distinct movements. The first of these is the witch's kitchen. Here the second appetite, when it becomes an end in itself and loses its rational purpose, produces a condition of pure sensuality. This condition forms a realm represented in the poem as the witch's kitchen, which may be understood as the perverted family. In this setting, the woman who has been deceived and cast out from the true family, rejected and treated with scorn, enters the wider world. Still driven by her domestic instinct, she establishes a form of family life, for the need for such a structure remains. However, this new formation is based solely on sensual gratification and lacks any rational or ethical foundation. It emerges within society as an organized yet destructive counterpart to the true family, undermining and opposing it from within. Into this sphere Faust is led by Mephisto, for it too belongs to his domain. The aim is to quiet desire, yet Faust gains little satisfaction from the experience. Only in one respect is he affected. In a magical mirror he glimpses an ideal human form, which awakens within him a longing for beauty. This moment marks the beginning of a new development, a turn toward the appreciation of form and harmony. Up to this point, his nature has shown little sign of aesthetic inclination, being absorbed instead in the pursuit of philosophical truth. Now, however, a hidden capacity begins to emerge, suggesting a future unfolding that will become more fully realized later. The second movement is the story of Margaret. This presents the reverse side of the perverted family, and may be seen as the history of the true family in its gradual fall into distortion and destruction. In this narrative, the workings of Mephisto are clearly displayed, as he uses persuasion and manipulation to subordinate the rational element to the sensuous. The effect is like a corrupting influence that transforms ethical life into its opposite. The outcome is tragic, for the characters cannot undergo this transformation without ruin. All those bound within the true family are destroyed in the process. This forms the tragedy of the family, a theme long explored in literature and deeply familiar to human experience. For this reason, this portion of the work is more accessible than others, employing a traditional form rather than an unfamiliar one. The story of Margaret is therefore widely recognized, though it represents only a part of the larger structure and must be understood within its full context. Beyond the family stands a broader unity, that of society. Within it exist the same two elements, the rational and the sensuous, and the same possibility of distortion. This sphere, while encompassing the earlier ones to a degree, also stands as an independent domain. When society as a whole is reduced to a means for individual aims such as wealth, ambition, or desire, it too becomes perverted. This condition is symbolized by the setting of the Brocken, a mountain associated with supernatural gatherings, where Walpurgis Night is celebrated. Here again, a world of witches is used to represent distorted human activity. This stage is presented in two forms. The first is Walpurgis Night itself, depicting a social world driven by material and personal pursuits, where the universal purpose of life is suppressed. It portrays the restless striving of individuals competing for dominance in various spheres of life. The second is Walpurgis Night's dream, which serves as an extension of the first and illustrates a similar distortion within intellectual and literary pursuits, where narrow aims replace broader understanding. Such is the structure of the perverted world as it unfolds, presenting a vast and complex design that encloses this portion of the work. It may appear as though this entire formation arises suddenly, taking on the solidity of fact. This naturally raises a question. Was such a conception fully present in the mind of the poet during its creation? Or does it exist only as an interpretation imposed afterward? These questions have been raised repeatedly and will continue to be examined. Yet the essential issue lies elsewhere. The primary concern is what is actually present in the work itself, not what may have been consciously intended during its composition. If the realm of Mephisto is clearly depicted, and if a sequence of scenes reveals a perverted world, then this reality must be acknowledged regardless of assumptions about intention. The reader must determine whether this interpretation arises naturally from the text. At the same time, it may be admitted that creative work can exceed conscious awareness, producing results greater than what was deliberately planned. Even in nature, structures may display order without deliberate calculation. Yet it would be unreasonable to assume that a thoughtful creator could fully understand humanity and the world while remaining unaware of the meaning within his own work. If this perverted world is indeed present, and that must be judged through careful reading, it is likely that its presence was not accidental. Still, perception varies. Some observers can discern deeper significance, while others perceive only the surface appearance, seeing nothing beyond what lies immediately before them. It is reasonable to suppose that the poet gradually arrived at a full understanding of this perverted world, along with its role and significance within the poem. A closer look at the history of its three principal scenes helps make this development clearer. Auerbach's Cellar, according to reliable evidence, was composed in the year 1775. It stands, therefore, among the earliest portions of the work, and although it possesses vigor and vividness, it does not yet display complete maturity in either purpose or form. The presence of the youthful creator is evident, focused strongly on immediate sensory effects, while a deeper vision is still forming beneath the surface. The Witch's Kitchen, written later in the year 1788 during a stay in Rome, belongs to a more developed stage of life. Here the perverted form appears more fully realized, reflecting the distortion of the family. Between these two compositions lies a considerable period of growth, though the seed of the later development is already contained in the earlier work. These two scenes continue their progression into a third, Walpurgis Night, which did not appear in the earlier fragment of 1790, but was included in the completed first part published in 1808, likely having been written a few years before, when the poet was approaching old age. In this way, the perverted world, like the poet's broader vision and creative work, unfolds over time, reaching completion through successive stages of life: youth, maturity, and later years. By the final stage, it is fair to assume that the creator, looking back, had gained a clearer awareness of what had been accomplished. The mythical treatment of this perverted world is original, as none of its three forms are directly present in the traditional Faust legend, though they are suggested by it and remain in harmony with its spirit. Auerbach's Cellar does not appear in the early Faust narratives, although certain similar elements may be found. The Witch's Kitchen is likewise absent, though the idea of witches and their practices is well established in folklore and literature. Walpurgis Night, too, is not found in the older versions of the story, even though it belongs to a broader tradition of myth preserved among the people. In this aspect, the poet emerges not only as a storyteller but also as a creator of myth. Rather than merely retelling inherited material, the myth is reshaped and reorganized into a new and living form, guided by a unifying vision while remaining true to its inherent nature. What once existed in fragmentary and undeveloped expressions is thus transformed into a complete and expressive structure, capable of reflecting an entire world. The discovery of an earlier version of the work has revealed Auerbach's Cellar in its initial form. In that version, it appears in prose, yet already contains the essential substance of the scene. It bears the marks of an intense and immediate creative impulse, showing a style that is vigorous and direct. In a later version, it appears in verse, with less raw intensity but greater balance and proportion. The deeper meaning of this perverted world can now be considered more fully. Taken on its own, the scene of Auerbach's Cellar functions as a brief comedic portrayal rooted in the deception of the senses. It demonstrates how human beings, when governed by appetite and placing reason beneath it, fall into persistent absurdity and lead lives marked by folly. Within this perverted tavern, the senses are shown undermining themselves. Without the guidance of reason, they mislead and disrupt one another, producing a situation that becomes unintentionally comic. The structure of the scene resembles a state of excess, where individuals lose their proper place in the world and descend into a condition both irrational and ridiculous. Mephisto stands at the center as the guiding force, manipulating perception through appetite in a manner that appears strange and magical, not always explainable in detail but clear in its overall intent. This is his domain, founded upon the pursuit of physical pleasure as the highest goal. It is a world he has shaped, and into it he brings Faust, hoping to draw him permanently into its influence. The agreement suggests that the desires of the soul will be satisfied through indulgence, and here is one example of such fulfillment. The company present, though not distinguished, represents the type encountered in this realm, for the journey now passes through the perverted world, where refinement cannot be expected. Their opening expressions make their orientation clear. They call for drinking and laughter, revealing that no higher purpose governs their actions. Their aim is enjoyment, even to the point of foolishness or crude excess, with no concern for meaningful activity. Their pleasures revolve in narrow circles, simple and repetitive, and even these tendencies easily turn toward disorder. There is little clear indication that this group consists of students, despite frequent interpretations suggesting so. Although the setting is Leipzig, a place associated with learning, the description points rather to a gathering of carefree individuals devoted to indulgence. They belong to a familiar social type, those who live for constant amusement, treating each day as a celebration as long as their means allow. Even their outlook extends into broader attitudes, expressed in their enthusiastic cries that unite the pursuit of freedom with the pursuit of pleasure, revealing the guiding principles of their existence. All these figures form a collective group in which only slight differences can be observed. Frosch appears somewhat coarser and more vulgar than the rest. Brander may be a little more refined and better educated. Siebel, older, bald-headed and heavy, seems more inclined toward quarrel and sharper in detecting deception. It is he who finally declares that everything was trickery and illusion. Altmaier, by contrast, seems the most trusting, though still suspecting some scheme. He even imagines seeing the pair depart riding upon a wine cask, and his last remark suggests belief in what appears to be a miracle. Yet none of these distinctions are strongly marked. The individuals are not sharply defined, nor could they be, for they function as a group, representing a type. The bummers who move together, driven by the same impulse and united in their common cry for freedom and wine. In such a condition, song naturally arises, and their sense of freedom expresses itself through it. This freedom signifies release from ethical restraint, and thus their songs include mocking remarks directed at church and state, the central institutions of society, which rest upon principles entirely opposed to those of this setting. Coarse humor and unrestrained speech become their chief source of wit. Even the theme of love enters, though not in its higher meaning. It is reduced to mere desire rather than the emotional bond of the family. The Song of the Rat offers a fitting image of the victim, poisoned by sensual appetite, and one among them remarks that the swollen creature mirrors their own condition, an observation that effectively explains the song itself. Such is the world of these figures, a condition that continues to exist and operate within society. It is an organized sphere, supported by resources and prepared to defend itself when challenged. It can be recognized in social life wherever groups gather under the same cry of indulgence, asserting their way of living and celebrating it openly. It stands as a form of organization grounded not in reason but in appetite, and therefore opposed to true institutions. At this moment, however, a new presence appears. Mephisto enters, the originator of this domain, bringing with him one who does not belong to it. Faust arrives, about to witness how easily life may be shaped when guided in a certain direction. The group, inflated by their condition, displays a mixture of physical excess and self-satisfaction. They quickly assume that the newcomers are inexperienced outsiders, while they themselves take pride in belonging to a place they regard as cultivated. Seeing an opportunity for amusement, they decide to make the visitors the objects of a jest. Yet Mephisto recognizes the situation clearly, aware that they do not realize the power already over them. Their intended mockery is soon reversed, as the one skilled in deception takes control and turns the situation to his advantage. Mephisto adapts himself effortlessly, joining them as though one of their own, and offers a song whose surface humor conceals a deeper implication. The flea within the song, elevated to prominence by a king, becomes a symbol of authority, rising above others while they remain below. The group responds enthusiastically, sensing a hidden satire, though it might just as easily apply to themselves, who depend upon the very system they mock. Their cry of freedom and wine sums up their identity and purpose. Within this situation, two forms of freedom become apparent. One places reason above impulse, guiding human life according to higher principles. The other reverses this order, allowing appetite to dominate while reason is subordinated. It is this latter form that prevails here, a distorted freedom that seeks satisfaction without regard for ethical order, a freedom that celebrates indulgence above all else. The outcome of this spectacle now unfolds, revealing the nature of this entire realm as illusion. Mephisto both creates and exposes this illusion, acting as its architect and its undoer. He first satisfies their desires by providing each with the drink they crave, fulfilling their expectations completely. Yet excess follows immediately, and with it comes consequence. The drink transforms into flame, causing pain, a result directly tied to their own excess. Instead of recognizing their own role, they turn in anger against Mephisto, blaming him for what they themselves desired and accepted. They rush at him with hostility, seeking to destroy what is in truth a reflection of their own condition. In the end, their world dissolves into confusion and illusion. What seemed real proves deceptive, and in their disoriented state they fail even to grasp their target, turning instead upon one another. When clarity returns, Mephisto has disappeared, leaving behind only the aftermath of their folly. The result is a fitting resolution. Those who abandon reason descend into absurdity, becoming caught in delusion. The senses, deprived of rational guidance, lose their reliability, and the world they construct becomes unstable and unreal. Even ordinary perception requires correction, for appearances can mislead, presenting things in a way that contradicts deeper understanding. Within this brief comedy, three forms of perversion become visible, all arising from the absence of the rational element in the senses. First appears the deceptive character of the external, visible world. Second comes the breakdown of the moral order within. And third emerges the construction of a world founded upon indulgence, which has been identified here as the perverted tavern. This last aspect is only faintly suggested within the scene itself, remaining largely in the background, yet it must be brought clearly into view as a real and active condition in order to grasp the meaning, connection, and structure of the episode. Such a perverted tavern is not hidden away in distant corners of society, but stands openly present, organized and vigorous, asserting its claim to build a way of life upon appetite as though it were an expression of human freedom. Let people partake of drink, guided always by reason, but when an entire structure exists for the degradation of human beings into creatures of appetite, it belongs to Mephisto, and its inhabitants display that condition in full. Faust, however, remains true to his deepest striving and finds no satisfaction in such excess. It becomes clear that this kind of indulgence cannot fulfill his desire for truth. Apart from a brief acknowledgment upon entering, his only expressed wish is to depart. The world he encounters here, one that undermines true institutions, repels him. From this experience he learns that without truth to guide perception, human beings fall into illusion, and without truth to restrain excess, they fall under destructive influence. The scene then shifts to the witch's kitchen, which proves even more bewildering and unsettling than the previous one. Its meaning is obscure, and its form appears strange and even disturbing. Faced with such material, one approach is to dismiss it entirely, declaring it meaningless or merely an elaborate attempt to confuse the audience. Some have even suggested that it serves to mislead interpretation, provoking futile attempts to uncover a depth that does not exist. Yet if this scene holds no meaning and no essential place within the development of the work, then the entire structure of the poem collapses. It could no longer be considered a unified creation with necessary progression or inner coherence. Such a conclusion would reduce a work of great scope to mere inconsistency, an idea that cannot reasonably be accepted. Instead, the scene must be approached with the assumption that it belongs integrally to the whole and arises from a deliberate artistic necessity. There is, therefore, another way to engage with such passages, to examine them patiently until their meaning becomes evident. Though they may seem to stand outside familiar literary forms and resist established standards of judgment, this very quality reflects originality. The creator does not simply follow existing rules, but establishes new ones within the work itself. The apparent strangeness is not a lack of order, but the presence of a different order that must be discovered rather than imposed. The proper attitude, then, is to allow the work to reveal its own principles, rather than measuring it by external expectations. Conventional standards often fail when applied to such a creation, and new ways of understanding must arise from within the work itself. This has always been the case with works of lasting significance. They reshape the methods by which they are judged. At this point, one must recall a fundamental principle of interpretation. A great work must be understood according to its own internal logic. The Witch's Kitchen demands such an approach, for it cannot be adequately judged by ordinary criteria. Personal preference offers no reliable guide. Whether one finds the scene appealing or not does not determine its value or necessity. Even Faust himself expresses discomfort with what he encounters, yet he must pass through it. The same is required of the reader, who must confront the scene and uncover its meaning. This is part of its truthfulness, reflecting the reality that not all necessary experiences are agreeable. Literature of this kind does not exist merely for enjoyment. While it may provide pleasure, it may also challenge and unsettle, and in doing so, it fulfills a deeper purpose. The poet does not write with the narrow expectations of any single reader in mind, nor does he shape his work according to individual pleasure or discomfort. Instead, his focus rests upon what is deepest, broadest, and most enduring in human experience, and to that alone he remains faithful. The reader, therefore, must set aside the demand for personal amusement. Works of lasting significance are not created merely to entertain, nor is their author a performer whose purpose is to pass the time or provide diversion. Such creations arise from a far more serious engagement with life and thought. It has often been assumed that the creator himself regarded certain scenes, including The Witch's Kitchen and Walpurgis Night, as mere nonsense. A frequently cited remark suggests that interpreters have failed to explain what appears as humorous confusion in these passages. Later critics, relying on this statement, have often avoided interpretation altogether or concluded that these scenes lack coherence and reflect only arbitrary invention. Yet such a reading overlooks an essential point. The remark does not deny meaning. Rather, It indicates that the meaning has not yet been properly understood. It acknowledges both aspects at once, that the scenes appear nonsensical, yet still contain significance. This apparent contradiction provides the key to understanding. There exists meaning within what seems meaningless, a rational element within what appears irrational. Though this may seem paradoxical, it calls for a deeper effort of thought rather than dismissal. The difficulty lies not in the absence of order, but in the presence of a different kind of order that must be discovered. The form may appear chaotic, even absurd, yet within that very form resides intention and structure. The scene takes on the character of excess, yet this excess is not without purpose. It reflects the very nature of what is being portrayed. The task, then, is to hold together these opposing aspects and recognize their unity. In doing so, one encounters a literary form that is unusual yet grounded in necessity. The scene must not be rejected as incoherent, for even in its apparent disorder it carries meaning that invites careful reflection. To clarify the matter, the main challenges of the scene may be considered in three parts. The first difficulty concerns its relation to the rest of the work. At first glance, it may seem disconnected, yet it must be understood as one aspect of the larger perverted world through which Faust passes. Seen in this way, it becomes an essential component of the overall structure, without which the whole would remain incomplete. The second difficulty lies in determining its internal meaning. This, too, emerges when the scene is viewed as an expression of the perverted family, whose distorted character it represents through its unusual and exaggerated actions. The third and greatest difficulty arises from the form itself. The strange and seemingly chaotic method of presentation may initially obscure understanding rather than assist it. Yet this form is not accidental. It arises directly from the subject, requiring a mode of expression that reflects distortion and imbalance. The method corresponds to the theme, making the form itself part of the meaning. It is not an arbitrary invention, nor merely a satire, but a necessary expression of the idea it conveys. From this perspective, the role of the reader becomes clearer. The task is to recognize meaning even within what appears absurd, to perceive coherence within disorder. At the same time, the scene must be understood in relation to what precedes and follows it, as part of a continuous and interconnected whole. Only then can the full structure of the perverted world be grasped as an essential element of the larger work. Before the scene fully unfolds, a brief introductory moment presents a conversation between Faust and Mephisto as they approach the witch's kitchen. Here, the central promise offered to Faust is the restoration of youth, yet this promise carries two distinct meanings. Mephisto intends a return to physical vitality, a renewal of desire and passion in one whose life of study has dulled such impulses. Faust, however, understands it differently. He longs to be freed from the weight of years of thought and struggle, to regain the openness, hope, and aspiration of earlier life before doubt and negation took hold. Thus, the same promise contains two opposing intentions, one rooted in the realm of desire, the other in the yearning for a renewed spiritual beginning. Mephisto's chosen instrument is the witch, through whom he intends to awaken dormant passion by means of indulgence. Faust, however, feels a strong aversion to both the witch and her methods. He senses that his renewed hope would be destroyed if no better means could be found, and thus he asks instead for some healing force drawn from nature or created by a noble mind that might restore youth. In this request, his earlier aspiration seeks to preserve its purity against the corrosive force of denial. Yet Mephisto dismisses this desire with mockery, offering an alternative that would strip life down to mere labor, reducing existence to the level of the simplest peasant and extinguishing all striving for truth. Such a path would be intolerable to Faust, for it would mean the death of his higher nature. Left with no other option, he follows Mephisto to the witch. Within this place, an elixir of life is to be prepared anew, a potion long associated with tales of witchcraft, where it is claimed that youth may be restored to all except the one who creates it. In this instance, the knowledge comes from the devil, though not the act itself. The spirit behind the process belongs to him. The poet draws upon this ancient and widespread belief, reshaping it into a new meaning that still preserves its connection to tradition. The idea of restoring youth contains two aspects, one physical, aligned with Mephisto's purpose, and one spiritual, which corresponds to Faust's deeper longing. For a moment, this higher aspiration rises again, only to be quickly suppressed as they pass through the outer spaces and enter the very center of the witch's kitchen, where the strange inhabitants must now be observed in their peculiar order. The scene divides into two parts, marked by the arrival of the chief witch. The first presents the occupants of this distorted household and their activity. The second introduces the witch herself with her potion. Throughout both parts, Faust and Mephisto remain present, each revealing their nature through their responses to what unfolds. Upon entering, they encounter what appears to be a family composed of male, female, and young, yet these beings are described as animals despite possessing speech and intelligence. This is a family stripped of its rational or spiritual element, reduced to instinct alone. To represent such a condition, the poet employs a strange, myth-like creature, a hybrid form resembling both human and animal. These beings are likened to cats, creatures marked by slyness, duplicity, and hidden aggression. They display outward friendliness yet conceal the capacity to harm, moving with the restless energy of nocturnal creatures driven by sensual impulse. The witch herself is absent, having gone out to revel, departing through an unclean and secret passage. She remains away while the young creatures busy themselves, warming themselves and preparing a concoction. The male figure approaches Mephisto with a mixture of flattery and cunning, urging him toward games of chance and wealth, revealing both dependence and manipulation. His complaints of hardship and poverty are familiar, accompanied by the claim that with money he would regain reason. In his current state, he exists without rational control, driven by need and reduced to instinct. His condition reflects a broader reality, one that can be recognized in everyday life wherever human dignity yields to necessity and desire. The scene then unfolds through a sequence of symbolic objects associated with witchcraft: a globe, a sieve, a pot, a brush, and a crown, each contributing to the progression toward the central act. The globe is introduced as a representation of the world, yet it is described as hollow, glittering on the surface but lacking substance, destined to break into fragments. This reflects a distorted view of reality, one that denies deeper meaning. The sieve, used by the female figure, serves as a tool of perception, filtering vision in a peculiar way, suggesting a selective and distorted understanding. Meanwhile, attention turns to the pot set upon the fire, an object whose significance seems obvious to its inhabitants but remains obscure to an outsider. Mephisto, engaging with the scene, takes up a brush and settles himself in a posture of mock authority, likening himself to a ruler who possesses the symbol of power but lacks its full adornment. In this moment, the mixture of play, symbolism, and distortion reaches a peculiar intensity, revealing a world in which appearances imitate structure but lack true substance. Mephisto truly stands as the ruler of this strange witch world, and even the symbol of sovereignty is offered to him by the creatures present, the animal-like offspring of this distorted household. Yet the crown they present is marked by corruption, associated with suffering and violence, and in the very act of offering it, it breaks apart. Some interpreters have sought hidden satire in certain expressions, but such readings miss the deeper point. The language here functions not literally but symbolically, and the thoughts expressed belong to these beings themselves, not to any elevated poetic voice. What appears is not the refined process of art, but the crude activity of instinct-driven existence. At this moment, the boiling vessel overflows, and a great flame bursts upward through the chimney, heralding the arrival of the ruling figure of this place. Before turning to her, attention remains briefly on the two visitors. Mephisto feels entirely at ease, delighting in the behavior of these creatures, engaging them with familiarity and enjoying their sensuous absurdity. This environment belongs to him. It is a realm shaped by indulgence, and he moves within it with ease. Faust, by contrast, is repelled by what he sees, finding the entire spectacle both grotesque and incomprehensible. Yet his reaction shifts when he gazes into the magic mirror presented before him. In that reflection, he perceives not mere physical form but an idealized human shape, a vision of beauty that awakens something new within him. Though the setting is coarse and degraded, this glimpse reveals the possibility of a higher form of expression, the emergence of an aesthetic awareness. For the first time, Faust encounters the human form as an object of ideal beauty, and this vision stirs within him a longing that points beyond mere sensation. This moment carries a dual significance. The human form he beholds contains both a higher and a lower potential. It can serve as the expression of beauty and spiritual elevation, or it can descend into the realm of crude desire. Both tendencies are present here, embodied in the contrast between Faust and Mephisto. Even within this environment of excess, Faust's deeper aspiration emerges, hinting at a future development that will later become central to his journey. For now, however, the vision remains indistinct, surrounded by confusion, yet powerful enough to leave a lasting impression. As the scene unfolds, these opposing tendencies continue to appear. Mephisto remains engaged with the creatures and their world, while Faust is drawn toward the image in the mirror, absorbed in its suggestion of beauty. His reaction intensifies, and he feels both fascination and unease, recognizing the danger of remaining in such a place. At that moment, the atmosphere grows more intense as flames rise, signaling the arrival of the witch herself. She enters as the dominant figure of this distorted household, presiding over its activities and bringing with her the means to achieve the purpose of the visit. Her appearance seems to emerge naturally from the surrounding chaos, as though she were generated by the very excess that defines the scene. The boiling vessel produces flames that announce her presence, and she arrives with force and hostility, reacting violently to what she encounters. Yet Mephisto quickly asserts control, revealing his authority over her. She recognizes him as the devil, her master, even though his outward appearance differs from the traditional image once associated with him. Though the external form has changed, the underlying nature remains the same, and she responds accordingly. The preparation of the potion now begins, carried out through a series of gestures and actions that appear irrational and confusing. The process is filled with symbolic language and exaggerated ritual, masking the underlying purpose. Mephisto observes with satisfaction, while Faust remains unsettled by the spectacle. The witch recites words that seem chaotic, yet within them lies a pattern that reflects the logic of excess and repetition. The progression described suggests an unrestrained multiplication of indulgence, where limits dissolve and repetition erases consequence. Though expressed in a manner that appears nonsensical, it reveals a deeper principle, the unchecked expansion of desire. Faust struggles to make sense of what he hears, perceiving only confusion and disorder, yet understanding is not required for participation. The act itself proceeds regardless of comprehension, and the result will be experienced rather than reasoned out. The scene, though outwardly irrational, continues to unfold with its own internal necessity, revealing through its very strangeness the underlying forces at work. Mephisto's remark upon the witch's strange reckoning has been interpreted in many ways. In his words, he appears to allude to the doctrine of the Trinity, suggesting that error has often been spread through combinations such as 3 and 1 and 1 and 3. Yet the witch herself has made no such claim. Her formula is not grounded in any theological meaning. It is Mephisto who reshapes her expressions to suit his own purpose, giving them a negative interpretation consistent with his character. Whether this view reflects only his perspective or also that of the creator may be considered, but in any case it reveals the spirit of denial that defines him. As Faust brings the potion to his lips, a small flame leaps up, giving pause for a moment. There is clearly danger in what he is about to do, perhaps the very burning force the witch has threatened. Yet he proceeds, for one who stands in direct encounter with such powers cannot shrink back. He drinks, and the ritual is completed. With a draught within him, he emerges transformed, now able to perceive a certain ideal in every form he encounters, though this perception is shaped according to Mephisto's influence. The witch, before departing, offers a final song, a parting note that accompanies the transformation. Mephisto explains the effect further, describing how new desire will awaken within him, moving restlessly and powerfully. Through this act, Faust becomes youthful in a particular sense, not through renewal of spirit, but through the stirring of passionate impulse. Earlier, in the presence of the strange household, he had glimpsed the human form as an ideal, apprehending its higher possibilities. Now through the potion he experiences the opposite side, entering into the realm of sensual gratification associated with the perverted family. The consequences of this transformation will soon become evident, yet even at this moment, a trace of his earlier aspiration returns. He asks once more to behold the image of beauty reflected in the mirror, desiring to retain that vision. Mephisto denies this request, as it does not serve his purpose. Still, the very existence of this wish suggests that something within Faust remains directed toward a higher goal. The image of ideal form, once seen, cannot be entirely lost. It remains as a positive element carried forward from this experience. This scene, composed during a period spent among the artistic remains of antiquity, reflects a meeting of different tendencies within the creator's own vision. On one side stands the northern, darker element, embodied in Mephisto and the witch. On the other stands the classical ideal, represented by the image that Faust perceives. These two directions, one leading toward degradation through indulgence, the other toward transformation through art, exist together and shape the development of the work. The setting itself may have inspired this contrast, where the remnants of a great past coexist with signs of decline. If Faust is to pass through all aspects of the perverted world arising from his own inner condition, then this stage is unavoidable. The structure of the work demands it, and the creator remains faithful to that necessity rather than to the expectations of an audience. The task required both courage and commitment, for without it the larger vision would remain incomplete. To express this material, a new form was required. It could not be presented directly in its full harshness, but instead takes on a symbolic shape, an orgiastic mode clothed in myth. This form reflects passion separated from its rational purpose, where the ethical foundation of the family has been removed and only desire remains. In such a condition, action becomes chaotic and irrational, yet within this apparent disorder lies a deeper meaning. The scene does not present pure sense, nor pure lack of sense, but a combination of both. In these distorted forms, the fundamental nature of human desire is revealed without its higher transformation into a meaningful and ethical relationship. The scene cannot be called beautiful in any simple or conventional way. Its value lies in its place within a larger whole, where even what appears disturbing contributes to the overall harmony. It suggests a broader conception of art, one capable of including not only what is pleasing but also what is unsettling. In this way, even elements that seem opposed to artistic order are drawn into it and given meaning. What appears irrational is brought into relation with reason, and through this connection it becomes part of a greater structure. The reader, therefore, must not remain satisfied with surface impressions, but must seek the underlying principle that gives coherence to what at first appears chaotic, recognizing the presence of meaning even within apparent disorder. With the introduction of Margaret, the direct counterpart to the witch's kitchen is brought forward. The true family now enters the scene, yet it is destined to be perverted and destroyed by the man who carries within his body the draught of the witch. Faust, made young again and inflamed with rejuvenated passion, steps out from his new indulgence and meets the first girl in the street. She is the honest maiden of humble life, returning from prayer and confession of sins she never committed, the typical girl, shaped by the domestic and religious instincts of her community, indeed of all Christendom. What will become of her when she meets Faust, the great denier of her entire world of duty and faith, and who also bears within him that potion which makes him see a Helen in every woman? In due order, the theme unfolds as the true family is perverted and destroyed. At this point it becomes necessary to consider the family and the church, Margaret's institutional world, which is now invaded by Faust and, insofar as she represents and upholds it, is annihilated. The two belong together in her instinct and form the source of the beauty, devotion, and tragic pathos of her character. The family has as its essential process the difference of sex elevating itself into the unity of marriage. This difference is the beginning, the natural side of sex, which must be transformed into the spiritual element, so that it becomes the union of man and woman into a new personality, as it were, ruling over each of them as individuals. This personality is called the family. Thus the family has two sides or phases, the sensuous or emotional, and the spiritual or rational. Its function is to fill the sensuous nature of man with a spiritual and eternal element, whereby passion, which is transient, is transmuted into love, which is permanent and holy. If, however, the sensuous element alone prevails, the degraded form of life appears, and the family becomes perverted. Thus the old difficulty returns in a new shape. Faust denies the spiritual element of the family, while the sensuous element of his nature has been intensified to youthful power by the witch's draught. Yet he retains a longing for the spiritual element, for the ideal side, though his skepticism suppresses his faith in it. As he once denied truth while still yearning for it, so now he dismisses in thought the spiritual meaning of the family while being driven toward its unity through feeling. He will love, but without reaching the fulfillment of love in marriage. The conflict thus reappears in a new form, now between love and the denial of love as mere lust. Yet emotion overwhelms denial. Through love he first feels, if not sees, truth. His rigid individuality begins to soften in love, and his skepticism cannot fully resist it, even when it drives him towards something higher than himself. Faust's first experience of truth comes through love. Though intellect is not conquered, the heart is touched. The path remains long, marked by struggle and inner conflict, yet it carries the faint light of dawn. The family is the sexual transformation of the human race. Through this truth Faust proceeds with his denial. Each individual is born into natural life marked by sex. This sex must be transformed into a spiritual existence, transfigured. The two sexes become a new unity. Each becomes a member of the family, and sex recedes into love, dissolving into union. The word love expresses the emotion of the family in all its stages, from its first emergence as a fleeting attraction, the initial spark, to the final settled state of marriage. Each member participates in this unity, where caprice and momentary desire are purified into enduring emotional harmony. Love begins as caprice, rises to passion, and ends as duty. In its final form, it settles from upheaval into calm, becoming a rational and serene existence. With denial within him, Faust cannot yet reach this state, though he will pass through its earlier stages. The duty of man is to transfigure not only the sexual aspect of life, but his entire finite existence. He must become not only a domestic, but also a religious being, so that all earthly actions are illuminated by spiritual light. His life is surrounded by another and higher institution, which may be seen as the universalized family, the Church. This includes the entire human race as one vast family, bound together in emotion, unified in a new personality, God, and held together by the deepest bond expressed in love, love of God. The Church, as universal family, is thus the protector of the particular family. In guarding it, it preserves its own essence, which is born at the domestic hearth. The emotion of love, first arising in the family, becomes universal in religion and expresses the highest relation of the individual to both humanity and Creator. This love also organizes itself into an institution, sustaining itself through worship as the enduring principle of finite life. Religion is therefore another transfiguration, the transfiguration of life in its totality. These two institutions protect Margaret. Both exist within her as emotional forces, while the sexual element also exists within her feeling life. With both sides mingled in emotion, she lacks the ability to distinguish or to subject passion to reason. Only knowledge could accomplish this fully, though instinct might go some distance. Margaret does not possess such intellectual strength. She lives in emotion without reflection, and her rational guidance must come from outside, from the two institutions embodied in her mother and her priest. She may become confused, undermined, and finally destroyed. This unfolding will occur in the house of Martha. Faust possesses intellect, yet that intellect denies the truth of the domestic relation and delivers him over to the senses. At the same time, a new emotion in him, love, continually lifts him back toward the very sphere his intellect rejects. Between these two forces lies his inner conflict. Margaret, however, lacks intellect in the sense of developed conscious reason. She carries the rational principle within her, but only as feeling. She is therefore not the self-centered woman capable of confronting Faust, the intellectual destroyer of her world. In this contrast lies the word of the great poet of the century concerning woman. The great philosopher of the century expresses a similar idea. Man is the active, objective principle, woman the passive, subjective. Man is thought, woman is feeling. Man tends toward the universal, woman toward the individual. She may possess fancy, wit, culture, but not philosophy. If this were her final nature, she would remain eternally a tragic figure. Or, if she is saved, her salvation depends upon not encountering a Faust. This may describe her past condition. Yet the new woman must also claim her intellectual birthright and, in doing so, become all the more fully woman. In that development she would be able to meet a Faust on his own ground, and even Mephisto himself. Such a figure, as noted by Denton Jaques Sinder in his commentary on Faust, could already be seen in formation within the Western world. Though earlier thinkers never witnessed her within European life, they may have understood the man, but not the woman. Yet the modern age demands that she, too, be saved just as Faust is. A future great literary work would need to express this. On American soil of that time, especially, Sinder observed, material appeared to be gathering for such a world book, its necessity rising from the depth of the age itself, and pointing toward its coming. It may even be written by a woman. In this portion of the drama, a clear change of literary form appears. The earlier vague and symbolic manner gives way to direct, natural representation, and the mythic coloring is set aside in favor of straightforward reality. For this reason this section is the most widely known. It is the story of ordinary domestic life. It is also the most frequently performed, since it deals with love and its conflicts, themes closest to common dramatic consciousness. The familiar material of poetry and the novel is used here, and the form follows the demands of the subject. Yet this is only one among many literary forms in the whole work. Other forms, less known or even unknown, also appear, and the greatness of the poem lies in this multiplicity. These forms must gradually become part of the world's intellectual possession, even if it takes long ages. The work is not a mere variation of an old tune on an old instrument. It is a new composition on many new instruments, and on the older ones as well, joined together in one vast orchestral harmony. The Margaret episode is only one strand within this larger symphonic movement, gentle and expressive in its proper place. Goethe's personal experiences are undoubtedly reflected in this story, yet his greatness lies in raising what is individual in himself into what is universal in humanity. Too much emphasis should not be placed on the purely biographical aspect, which is not poetry in itself. Rather, his own statement in the work should be remembered. The poet is the one who calls the individual person or matter to its universal consecration. The church within which Margaret lives is the Catholic Church, and this is absorbed into the broader sweep of the great Protestant legend. Her world is enclosed within this religious horizon. The priest, the rites, the cathedral, and the Virgin form the background of her drama. Faust, of Protestant origin, has moved beyond Protestantism into negation of all ecclesiastical limits. The Catholic setting of Margaret's story is therefore significant, especially in contrast with the other major female figure of the drama, Helen, who belongs to the heathen world and appears in the second part. The medieval worldview is thus represented in Margaret and her environment, and it becomes tragic in the presence of Faust's denial, though it still contains within itself a path toward salvation. Her tragedy is ultimately transformed through faith in the process of redemption. This portion of the drama was largely composed around the year 1775, more than a decade before the witch's kitchen that precedes it. Other parts of the work were also written across widely separated periods, spanning more than 60 years. Though this may appear inconsistent on the surface, it is precisely this long development that allows the creation of a unified and harmonious whole. Goethe, more than most writers, understood how to wait. He recognized what could not yet be completed and what must be left for the future when thought had matured. He set aside early and unfinished conceptions until experience and life had ripened them. The drama of Margaret thus reflects the exact emotional tone required by its subject, just as The Witch's Kitchen does, even though they were written many years apart. These varied literary forms could only develop within him over time. Many such narratives could have emerged, but they would still have been variations of the same essential idea. These differences of period should not fragment the poem in the reader's mind, as they have done for many critics. Instead, they must be understood as elements of a richer, deeper, and more varied harmony. We may now set forth a brief outline that indicates the inner structure of this small drama of Margaret as it unfolds within the larger drama of Faust. 3 stages can be distinguished. First, there is love, with its essential conflict between the rational and sensuous element within itself, a conflict visible in both Faust and Margaret, though in different forms. In Faust, the intellect denying the truth of love hands him over to passion, while his aspiration, intensified by love, reaffirms that truth. In Margaret, instinct or unconscious reason urges her to remain within home and church, yet her sensuous nature draws her beyond their shelter. Both thus experience a similar conflict and a similar temptation. Faust withdraws into the forest and even into a cavern in order to escape the painful tension, but left to himself and to intellect alone, without the corrective of love, he falls under Mephisto's stronger influence, and his sensuous nature prevails. Margaret, on the other hand, becomes so wholly absorbed in the emotion of love that she loses herself. No longer self-centered, she becomes tragic when her church, her final refuge, is shattered by her lover. This leads to the fall of Margaret and the destruction of her entire family, followed by her desperate appeal to the church for rescue from the consequences of her act, an appeal that is and must be refused. The scenes that follow present this development in sequence, written in the most immediate and transparent flow of poetic inspiration. Margaret's naive expressions go directly to the heart, often bringing both smile and tear at once. Goethe's symbolic manner here becomes so clear and direct that metaphor is scarcely used. The language is the simplest and most transparent expression of the human soul, yet it vibrates with deep emotion. The flexible verse, irregular in rhyme and line length, creates a tone close to natural conversation, yet remains perfectly responsive to Margaret's inner heartbeat. This naive speech reaches its highest beauty in the songs, simple to the utmost degree, yet never ordinary, but rather pure outpourings of the soul. The scenes of the Margaret story may now be considered in order, following their original sequence. At once the effect of the draught from the witch's kitchen becomes visible. Faust, encountering the unknown girl in the street, offers her arm and escort with flattering words. She refuses, which only increases his desire, and it becomes evident that he already sees a Helen in every woman. Mephisto appears, as he must, and is commanded to obtain the girl, whose innocence is precisely what makes her attractive. He hesitates and even moralizes, only to heighten Faust's urgency. The difficulty itself becomes part of the allure, for she cannot be won by force, but only by strategy. The plan is to find her outside the protection of her home, and to approach her first with gifts, immediately, in order to capture her childlike imagination. Thus appears the sensuous pressure directed against the family, and the scheme devised for its satisfaction. In the next scene Faust and Margaret are both present, not in direct encounter, but in a kind of spiritual proximity, each sensing the atmosphere of the other. In contrast to the previous scene, which revealed the sensuous aspect of Faust's love, he now experiences its spiritual and truthful side. He enters Margaret's room secretly and steps into the sphere of the home, breathing the air of the family. It is no surprise that he dismisses Mephisto, saying, "Leave me here alone." This is a new world for him, filled with repose, order, content, so unlike his own existence. In a rapturous soliloquy, he contemplates the family in its various stages. The old armchair calls forth the image of the aged grandfather surrounded by descendants. The bed suggests the mysterious emergence of new life, nature unfolding in light dreams the inborn angel. Childhood, old age, and all intermediate stages are gathered under this protecting presence. O dear hand of love, godlike, through thee the hut becomes a heaven. Faust exclaims that he no longer recognizes himself. For a moment he has perceived the divine aspect of love as revealed in the family. Yet it must not be forgotten that he came with the intention of setting a trap, bringing a box of jewelry. At this thought Mephisto reappears, but Faust hesitates, unwilling to violate this new world. Only under Mephisto's mocking ridicule of his idealizing mood does he allow the casket to be placed where Margaret will find it. Margaret returns after their departure, though their presence has left a lingering atmosphere. How sultry, muggy here! She senses something foreign within the purity of the room and feels a shudder pass through her, which she bravely tries to suppress. The reader knows that her encounter with Faust has already left its mark, despite her resistance. If I only knew who that gentleman was. She has presentiment of what is to come, an unconscious awareness of destiny. In this mood she sings the ballad of the King in Thule, a song that expresses one of the deepest traits of German spirit. Its emotional vibration is so delicate that it resists cold explanation, yet its meaning and purpose within the scene remain part of the unfolding inner drama. It is a plain narrative of fidelity. A king remains true to his mistress, his bull, and this first word casts a light forward toward the future Margaret. To him, this mistress, as she is dying, gives a golden beaker which becomes the most precious possession of his life, and at his death he throws it down into the sea, as though it must accompany him beyond. The shifting tones and distant meanings of the song are not grasped directly, yet its connection at this point of premonition can be stated. Such a beaker, given by a dying Margaret, is what Faust will cherish until his death, and from it he will drink his last life-glow. It is an instinct that runs through the whole poem to its end. It points toward the fall, the tragedy, and also gives a faint light of what lies beyond the tragedy. From this elevated mood Margaret is pulled downward when she discovers the casket of jewels. After the prophetic side of her nature has been shown, the weak and unguarded side now appears. She is caught by childish vanity. She adorns herself with the jewels, expressing the innocent first impulse toward ornament. Her narrow life of poverty makes gold and trinkets appear especially powerful to her. Mephisto has understood this weakness and strikes at it directly. Yet one is led to ask whether there is no protecting hand over the innocent girl. In the promenade that follows, that protecting force does intervene and frustrates the devil, who falls into anger and distorts his face, even exclaiming that if he were not the devil he would give himself to the devil. Mephisto then recounts the story of the jewels in a tone of biting satire, where each word cuts like a blade. When the mother sees the casket, she is seized by a secret dread. Her religious instinct directs her response, and she turns from the earthly motherly role to the Mother of God, to the Holy Family. A priest is called and accepts the gift, as he must, and the raging devil expresses his view of the church through the priest's imagined voice. The church is said to have a mighty stomach, to have swallowed entire countries without feeling satiety, and to be able to digest even ill-gotten wealth. Whether this reflects the poet's own view is uncertain. What is certain is that it is Mephisto's view. The mother and the priest, however, are shown as acting correctly in resisting evil, and in this way they thwart the devil, who responds with demonic abuse. In theatrical performances of Faust, these lines are sometimes greeted with the strongest applause. Yet such applause reveals a narrow misunderstanding. It is applause for the devil's fury against the church because it has rescued an innocent girl. The church has indeed a mighty stomach, and its history includes grave abuses in which Mephisto himself is often implicated. Thus the devil condemns what is in part his own work. Still, the positive force of the church is also shown clearly, for it appears here as the organized universal family of humanity, holding the human race together in love. It protects the individual family as well, and succeeds in doing so in this instance. This hostile portrayal belongs to the denier's viewpoint, Mephisto's standpoint, not the poet's, though the Mephistophelian aspect of the church is certainly acknowledged. Margaret, however, is not satisfied, and this becomes a source of danger for her, even though satisfaction would end the drama at this point. When her mother gives the jewels to the priest, the young girl makes a wry face. When they are taken away, she sits in unrest, uncertain of what she wants or what she ought to do. A struggle begins within her as she thinks of the one who brought the jewels, and from this moment the devil finds a second opportunity to act. She must therefore be removed from the influence of both maternal forces, her own mother and the motherly presence of God. A female neighbor has already been identified whose home is free from both the human and divine domestic order. Martha's house introduces another family, with a woman at its center whose husband has abandoned her, apparently not without reason. Yet she is not wholly false. She must not be imagined as belonging to the witch's kitchen. She is a grass widow, too self-centered for true devotion in the family, yet not a fallen woman. She believes she loves, but a single word is enough to turn her from affectionate expressions, even from tears for her husband, into sharp abuse. She is a scold without real devotion, though still maintaining its appearance in both directions at once. While lamenting her husband as dead, she also laments that she has no official certificate of his death. Such a woman can easily shift her attachment from one husband to another, since the emotional weight is not heavy. The young Margaret becomes attached to this woman, whose conversation naturally revolves around husbands. In terms of devotion they stand in opposition, yet the gossip of this companion offers something to the girl's developing nature, which is strictly restrained at home. In truth, it is the sensuous element in both that draws them together. This is the underlying basis of their connection, despite the clear spiritual difference, which is not strong enough to repel, while enough is shared to attract the young girl as she moves toward womanhood. This is the fact understood by Mephisto. Every seducer understands it and builds upon it. The imagination of the maiden, together with the awakening force of youth, is not corrupted here, but filled with the stimulating talk of Martha. Martha's relation to the family is mirrored in her relation to the church. She is not entirely outside it, yet she is by no means within it in heart and soul. It rests on her as lightly as her domestic role. She is precisely the one to advise Margaret, in regard to the second casket, that, "You must not tell your mother, it will go to the priest again." This is the decisive moment. The young girl is thereby separated from mother and priest, and from what they represent. Her childish vanity again takes control, though not without an inner protest from a better instinct. There is something not right in this matter. Into this group, now freed from mother and priest, Mephisto is able to enter. Indeed, he has been circling around them all along. In his conversation with Martha, her character becomes clearly defined. Her mixture of pretense and sincerity, her sudden shifts from love to hate and back again, and above all her husband-seeking impulse, now pursued with outward propriety, so that Mephisto must withdraw, otherwise she will take the devil at his word. In the same direction, he attempts to influence Margaret, first through flattery, then by speaking of a husband or suitor, and finally by questioning her state of heart. This is the natural environment for such insinuations, which she resists, still innocent, though not entirely without awareness, for she must already have heard similar talk from Frau Martha, whose mind is filled with such matters, and the state of her own heart is already partly known to the reader. The scene is somewhat extended beyond strict necessity, yet it is rich in Mephisto's irony. He fully understands the woman and takes pleasure in forcing her to reveal herself for his own amusement. Margaret listens to this conversation, uncertain about much of it. The atmosphere necessarily affects her, though she does not realize it, so different from her own domestic surroundings. It serves as preparation for what is to follow, the influence that will enter her being and awaken her sensuous nature. Husbands and lovers form the central theme here, within this witch's kitchen prepared for Margaret. Frau Martha, above all, desires a certificate confirming the death and burial of her husband, since she is a friend of order in such matters. She also wishes to read him dead in the newspapers. 2 witnesses are required. The second is Faust, who is absent at present. That evening Mephisto will bring him, describing him as a good fellow, much travelled, a lady's man. Will Margaret come? She agrees, though she says she will blush deeply in his presence. She remains modest and innocent, yet already there is the sign of a protest in her blush. Still, what does all this talk of husbands mean? She will not stay away, if she can once again escape from mother and priest, for which the innocent girl already shows a quiet capacity for subtle evasion. In the street, Faust is confronted with a demand to bear false witness. yet he refuses. Still, a spark of his moral nature produces a protest, which is immediately attacked by Mephisto with sharp mockery. Has he never borne false witness? When he so confidently gave definitions of God, world, man, what did he truly know of them more than of Herr Schwertlein's death? The old denial returns, the same that appeared at the beginning of the poem. Mephisto continues as the sophist, especially since Faust has abandoned the role of teacher in order that he might not be forced to say what he does not know. Yet, pressing further, Mephisto adds another thrust. On the next day he will betray poor Margaret and swear eternal love to her. Faust strongly denies this, defending the truth of his feeling and declaring it eternal. For a moment, he affirms the side of pure aspiration, the spiritual element within him. But for him there is, in truth, no secure spiritual element, or at least nothing of it can be known. Thus Mephisto replies again, insisting, "Still I am right," and Faust is compelled to yield, "Thou art right chiefly because I must." It is another movement of rise and fall, resistance and surrender. Aspiration still blossoms briefly, but denial quickly destroys it. In the garden scene, the two pairs meet at Martha's house. What unfolds there is love-making, for her home is its setting, though it appears in two sharply contrasting forms. Each pair is shown 3 times, one rising toward a climax, the other sinking into an anticlimax. Both women begin from a similar point, both seeking husbands, though one does so deliberately and without love, the other without calculation and with love itself. Martha, in conversation with Mephisto, reveals the same traits as before. To remain a bachelor and go alone to the grave seems to her one of the worst fates. The irony is that she proves too strong for even Mephisto. This female counterpart of deceit unsettles him, and he avoids her questions until she grows tired and dismisses him under the pretext of neighborhood gossip. For her it is a simple matter. Once one husband is gone, she is already prepared for another. Whoever refuses the exchange may leave her sphere. So she ends the conversation with a yawn, as the night is breaking off unless business is intended. Meanwhile Faust and Margaret gather the sweetness of the moment. She immediately senses his superiority in knowledge and worldly experience, and this both attracts and frightens her. She says her humble words are unworthy of such a learned man. Faust, however, has already seen the emptiness of knowledge and now feels the reality of love. One glance or word from her gives him more delight than all the wisdom of the world. This is no exaggeration. At this moment love not only delights him but teaches him more than wisdom ever has, revealing truth itself and answering his deepest aspiration. What has done this before? Not all the formal disciplines of learning. She again remarks that he is more intelligent than she is, but Faust responds that what is commonly called intelligence is often nothing but vanity and narrowness. This is his new experience, surpassing knowledge and quietly overturning his earlier denial. Margaret, having given herself so fully, asks in return for love, as is natural to its deepest nature. She fears being forgotten when absent and asks him to think of her, while she will always have time to think of him. This is her surrender, but to what? In the simplest and most profound words of girlish innocence, the answer is given: to the family. She gently complains about her mother's strictness, yet without bitterness. She describes her home life with devotion, including father, brother, and sister. Most important is her account of caring for the infant, the little worm, revealing the deepest instinct within her, motherhood itself. It is the most beautiful and fundamental of human instincts, yet also the point at which she will be vulnerable and ultimately destroyed. The greatest good lies very close to the deepest danger. Indeed, overcoming that danger transforms it into the highest good. Her devotion to the family and its highest instinct is complete. Her sensuous nature rises naturally into an ethical and spiritual sphere, yet this very quality becomes the source of a tragedy. Faust then recalls the moment outside the cathedral, when he offered her his arm and escort. Did she recognize him when he entered the garden? This question reveals the two sides within her. She initially regarded the offer as an insult to her honor, yet she was nonetheless drawn to it. The attraction was stronger than the offense, Something within her began to incline in his favor, though she was also angry with herself for not being more angered at him. Two spirits already struggled within her. The question is which will prevail. Faust utters here a word of deep significance for him. Eternal, he declares. This love must be eternal, eternal. Its end would be despair. No end, no end. He is in a state of ecstasy, yet it means much that he is able to feel, even if only as feeling, that something eternal exists. It remains feeling alone. Intellect may destroy it, yet he has experienced the eternity of love. It will never disappear entirely for him. Though suppressed by denial and covered over by passion, it will rise again as his first clear realization of truth. Mephisto already calls him away, but is now rebuked as a beast, as one who disturbs true love. The woman, confronted with the man who knows, sinks before him. Margaret falls before Faust's intellect. How such a man can think everything? With such a man, woman becomes tragic. The question arises, what is the resolution of her tragedy? She must also come to know, must be able to meet the man on his own ground, though in a distinctly womanly manner, a resolution which, as already indicated, is not provided by Goethe. The casket of jewels now disappears from the narrative. It has fulfilled its purpose by removing Margaret from the influence of mother and priest. Refusing it a second time becomes the test. First she listened to herself long enough to bring it to Martha's house, then she followed Martha's counsel. Martha thus acts as her female Mephisto, and has effectively driven off the male Mephisto in this scene, where a woman appears capable not only of meeting the man on his own ground, but of confronting the devil himself in a genuinely Mephistophelian manner. At this point, the second major phase of the drama of Faust and Margaret begins. Faust's declaration of love has introduced the word eternal, recognizing in this relationship something beyond transient passion or mere sensuous desire. Yet this very idea awakens the Mephisto within him, the spirit that denies, for love alone, as emotion, does not satisfy intellect. Thus the old struggle returns in intensified form. Not aspiration for knowledge, but love in its full force now opposes destructive denial. The result is a conflict so severe that Faust must flee, from the presence of the beloved into forests and caverns, seeking in solitude the relief of his wounded spirit. The spirit to whom he turns in prayer grants him relief, but at the same time brings Mephisto as well. In the absence of the loved one, the devil gains dominance in the struggle. Faust returns to Margaret changed by this withdrawal. His destructive intellect has had time to weaken the spiritual and eternal dimension of love that he had briefly grasped. Margaret undergoes an equally severe inner conflict. She is entirely absorbed into emotion, where her spiritual instinct and sensuous nature become confused and entangled, making her vulnerable first to Faust's intellectual denial and then to its moral consequences. The following three scenes present each lover separately, and then both together. In the forest and cavern, Faust is found in his retreat praying to the Spirit Sublime, the one who had granted him all he had asked for. Immediately a difficulty arises, who this spirit is, and what Faust truly asked for. He declares, "Not in vain didst thou turn to me thy countenance in fire," a phrase that seems to recall the earth spirit from the first soliloquy. He continues that this power didst give glorious nature as my realm, and the power to feel, to enjoy it, though this does not align with the earth spirit but rather suggests a nature spirit also present in that early vision. He further claims he was led to the secure cavern and shown to himself, though no earlier account records this, except as what may now be occurring. He also insists, "Thou didst give me this companion, Mephisto," though this does not match the earlier account of Mephisto's appearance. Yet he confesses, "I can no longer do without him," calling him an inseparable part of himself, one who humbles, degrades me before myself, revealing the deep dualism within Faust. And still, with a single word, this spirit turns its own gifts to nothing, having given good things and simultaneously the destroyer of them, Mephisto. These are the central points, full of contradictions and difficulties, in a brief monologue written in blank verse after the classical manner of Iphigenia, likely belonging to Goethe's Italian period. Many interpretations have been attempted. Some have claimed it reflects another plan of Faust, incompatible with the final version, perhaps left unchanged by mistake. Others have tried to identify the spirit sublime as the earth spirit of the first soliloquy, but such theories only multiply difficulties rather than resolve them. The simplest course is to let theory pass and attend directly to the poet's words, which become clear when read without imposed systems. What the poet earlier distributed among different spirits is here gathered into one spirit sublime, which includes them all, even Mephisto. It rises toward the level of the Lord in the prologue in heaven, within whose order Mephisto is still a part. The spiritual principle of the world, previously divided into nature, earth, man, and devil, is here united. This represents an advance over earlier soliloquies, where denial came from outside and destroyed aspiration from without. Now both gift and destruction arise from one source. What was previously implicit is now openly stated. Even the meter is significant, as Goethe never changes verse without meaning. The classical iambics express a calm, balanced repose, reflecting Faust's momentary harmony after struggle, just as Goethe's own classical phase followed earlier turbulence. Faust has found relief through communion with nature, the gift of the spirit sublime, yet even this gift contains its opposite. Mephisto appears as the accompanying force. The serene classical tone breaks into rough, Gothic doggerel filled with volcanic energy, as Greek form yields to Teutonic substance. Yet the evil spirit continues its work, even within this retreat. It degrades me before myself, lowering the higher nature to the lower. Even in the forest, nature's peace does not last, for it is busily fanning in my breast a lawless flame for that fair image. Thus the giver of good also returns the gift of evil. Relief awakens sensuous impulse again. Thus I tumble from desire to indulgence, and in indulgence I pant for desire. At this point Mephisto, the inseparable companion, appears at once, as if summoned from the air. It is clear that Mephisto seeks to draw Faust away from solitude and back toward Margaret, under renewed influence. He mocks Faust's communion with nature, comparing him to an owl in dark caves or a toad in dripping stone. The mockery reflects the satire directed at Goethe himself for his studies of nature. His nights in mountain solitude, his ecstatic contemplation of earth and sky, his striving toward total knowledge. The devil's irony attacks all such aspiration, asking where it ends, in sensuality and base reality. The same old effort returns, to pull Faust down from striving, and the implied answer remains: it will not cease until life itself ends. In this phase of the struggle, Mephisto makes a more pointed attempt. He brings before Faust the image of Margaret, awakening renewed passion. Faust resists again, recognizing the scheme and calling Mephisto a procurer. Yet he is forced to listen, for this companion is inseparable from himself. Through vivid sensuous images and insinuations, Mephisto tries to revive the lower element that was suppressed in Faust's retreat to the cavern. The conflict turns again, rising and falling, as though man and devil are locked above and below one another in endless reversal. When the turmoil settles, Faust is seen yielding, sinking under the pressure. He compares himself to a mountain torrent that destroys the peaceful alpine hut of Margaret. He knows he must go forward, even while foreseeing the ruin it will bring. "Hell, thou must have this sacrifice," he declares, and refuses to flee from consequences. "May her fate fall on me, and well must both to ruin." At this desperate moment Mephisto mocks him, identifying Faust with himself completely. "Courage! Thou hast become a pretty good devil, nothing more insipid than a devil who despairs." Thus even the principle of love is not enough to restrain Faust. The feeling exists, but it is not conviction. His intellect can scatter it, yet the emotion still struggles strongly. When the spiritual element is removed through denial, what remains is only the sensuous. Love alone cannot reach or expel Mephisto, who is entrenched in the intellect. This is the result of Faust's withdrawal. Meanwhile, Margaret must be considered in his absence. In Margaret's room, she too undergoes her own intense struggle. Sitting alone at her spinning wheel, her inner state breaks forth in a song of repeated emotional sighs. Love dominates her, and her individuality is dissolved within it, lost to the point that she cannot reclaim it. "My peace is gone," she cries, repeating it as the central note of her entire lament. "It is gone forever. I never, never more shall find it." With her own selfhood lost, she turns entirely toward the beloved, living only in his image, holding on to his absent form through imagination, yet painfully aware it is only an image and not reality. She is completely absorbed in emotion, without rational center or self-control. The song becomes a premonition of her fate. If she is attacked through these feelings, she will not recover herself. Her devotion is absolute, yet within it lies danger. The final tone, infinitely tender, also carries the possibility of infinite sorrow. Could I but catch him and hold him and kiss him as I would like, I would vanish in his kisses. Love reaches its extreme here, where ecstasy turns toward tragedy. The song is prophetic, for she will indeed vanish in his kisses, having already surrendered her own will. Like Faust, she gives herself up. Both stand as counterparts, man and woman. His tragedy rooted in intellect, hers in emotion. The song is therefore not an incidental lyric, but a necessary part of the drama, shaped in the simplest lyrical form, where each line becomes an immediate outburst of the heart's movement. In Martha's Garden, Faust and Margaret are brought together again after their separate struggles. Each has already shown failure in yielding control to the rational principle. Margaret submits because she lacks developed intellect to resist emotion. Faust possesses intellect, but it has been undermined by his own denial, leaving him exposed to sensuality. Now their union reveals the consequences of these opposing weaknesses. Margaret asks Faust to make a promise, though its content becomes clear only through her questioning of his faith. Religion remains her last protection, the spirit of the universal family. If Faust acknowledges it, she feels safe. If not, she senses danger. Her concern is not only for his eternal fate, but also an instinctive awareness that he stands outside Christianity, and that his denial carries consequences for her as well. Just as she has revealed her domestic world simply and openly, she now expresses her religious faith with equal directness. "How is it with thy religion?" With this question, Margaret seeks to draw Faust back toward the shelter of the church, from which she herself once stepped outward, and now tries in turn to restore him. The promise she presses for is meant to bind him again to that refuge. But Faust belongs to a liberal view of the matter. "I shall rob no one of his feeling and his church," since the church, in his understanding, is only a matter of feeling, something left to individual preference. Yet Margaret insists on faith itself. One must believe therein, allowing no indifferent tolerance, but demanding a firm and active belief. Faust, in his generous manner, acknowledges the holy sacraments, but she perceives that this honor is empty, given without longing for them. The contrast between their religious positions is already clear. Then comes the decisive question: "Believest thou in God?" For Margaret, this is the highest test of man. For Faust, however, this question strikes at the core of his earlier denial that man can know truth. God, in the sense of all religions, would be the embodiment of that highest truth in a governing personality. Yet for Faust, God is at most a feeling. For Margaret, he is a real existence who rules the world. Faust answers, "Who dares say, 'I believe in God'?" suggesting that any such claim by priest or sage would sound like mockery. By this, the entire tradition of priests, poets, and sages who have affirmed belief in God appears to him questionable, yet he turns the contradiction back on itself. Who dares say, "I believe not in God"? This becomes the expression of agnostic uncertainty, caught between affirmation and denial, unable to stand on either side. Such a position would leave even a strong mind in a kind of intellectual unrest, and for Margaret it becomes confusion she can hardly grasp. Faust then attempts to give a definition of the God in whom he both believes and does not believe, thereby doubling the contradiction. Many have taken this as a kind of elevated religious insight, where God becomes an oscillation between affirmation and denial. In his explanation, God is reduced to bliss, heart, love, and ultimately to feeling itself. Feeling is all. The objective reality of God is dismissed as unknowable, while only subjective experience remains. Yet Faust does at least elevate his love to something divine, which marks a development in him compared to his earlier state. Margaret, however, becomes increasingly confused. About so speaks the priest too. Still her instinct warns her that something is wrong, for thou hast no Christianity. Her reasoning is shaken, but her inner certainty briefly rises to contradict him. Yet whether such instinct can withstand denial from without and passion from within remains uncertain. Much interpretation has been given to this scene, often attempting to supply what the poet has not explicitly stated. Some critics have found in it profound religious thought, while others read it differently. But rather than resolving the contradictions theoretically, its place in the unfolding action must be observed. Margaret is shown as bewildered. Her attempt to protect herself through faith becomes clouded by Faust's words. In this condition, Faust leads her toward moral collapse by emphasizing feeling alone. Feeling is all. Yielding to this, she is drawn into the consequences of that surrender. The immediate result of this confusion is her ruin, which follows directly from this exchange. Thus the scene reveals not abstract doctrine, but action and consequence. Faust himself is not presented as a hypocrite, but as a sincere doubter, carrying denial through with consistency and courage, though this very honesty leads him into destructive results. The strongest proof that "thou hast no Christianity" is given by Margaret herself. She confesses, "It has long grieved me to see thee in such company," meaning the devil, whose presence her instinct judges with precision. He always looks in at the door scoffing and half enraged. She recognizes in him no love, and in his presence she cannot pray. Yet Faust silences this inner protest, and instead offers her a draught meant to make her mother sleep, so that their love may proceed without supervision. But this drink becomes the sleep of death for the mother, a responsibility that falls upon Faust, even though it remains uncertain whether he intended such an outcome or whether Margaret herself, through error or distraction, increased the dose beyond 3 drops. Still, it is Faust who bears the blame, and his act is not inconsistent with his own conception of God. Margaret leaves him with her religious scruples weakened or suppressed. The immediate result is the sleeping potion given to her mother. Religion and family are once again swept away together. Not the priest, but the denier now governs her actions. Both her guiding institutions collapse along with her own inner stability. After dismissing her in expectation of the moment when breast to breast and soul to soul compressed will be fulfilled, Faust again encounters Mephisto, who appears from the surrounding air. A brief struggle follows, though it is more appearance than real resistance, since Faust has already yielded in the forest. Mephisto strikes him with mockery, "Thou supersensuous, sensuous lover," pointing to his divided nature. Faust's resistance is only superficial. Mephisto already anticipates what will happen. "Tonight, I shall have my share in the fun." In this much-debated scene, Faust's religious speech, whatever its interpretation, has the effect of confusing Margaret's faith in church and duty to her mother, leading ultimately to her ruin. 2 related questions are often raised: whether these religious views belong to Goethe, and whether they belong to Faust. In Goethe's case, the evidence is mixed, sometimes suggesting belief in a personal God, sometimes not. Observers like Eckermann often misinterpreted him, recording statements without grasping their deeper meaning, and thus distorting their perspective. Such reports, therefore, provide little certainty, yet it is clear that Goethe repeatedly affirmed, in some form, "I believe in God." In the Prologue in Heaven, for instance, the idea of a world-governing divine order is unmistakable. Goethe's views likely shifted in nuance over time, but a fundamental conception remains visible throughout. As for Faust, whether he considers it mockery to say, "I believe," or "I disbelieve," is likewise uncertain. Earlier, he prays to the Spirit Sublime, conceived as a unity of world, humanity, and devil, suggesting at least some form of belief. The apparent contradiction between passages may stem from different stages of composition, but more deeply it reflects Faust's own internal confusion. Even Faust's motive for the decisive act remains ambiguous. Whether it arises from deliberate intent or from the uncontrollable force of his own denial cannot be fully resolved. He himself compares his action to a cataract that must destroy the alpine hut of Margaret as it rushes downward. Both will and necessity are involved, but the deeper current is necessity. His denial, which has taken hold of his inner being and drives him forward like a consuming force toward Margaret. Thus the scene must be understood in connection with what follows. It shows faith bewildered and knowledge undermined. Yet from this confusion emerges a clearer light over the drama as a whole. Faust's religious discourse becomes the preparatory condition for the act of destruction, putting not only the mother into a fatal sleep, but also temporarily blinding and separating Margaret from her protecting sphere, the Church. We have now reached the third stage of Margaret's history, which may be called the fall, involving the complete destruction of the family in its sweep, while at the same time the Church is taken away from Margaret, since it rejects her piteous prayer for help. She becomes an outcast, more than an outcast, a criminal. Her world, containing her two institutions, is closed against her, and she, through her own act, has destroyed both. At the fountain, the story is told at the town fountain, where another girl's case is narrated so that Margaret is forced to hear her own deed judged, condemned, and scattered through low gossip and ugly malice among the people. The account is delivered in a coarse manner, yet with piercing force, by the vulgar, envious Lizzie. It must be so that Margaret may recognize what her own image becomes in her own town. Her deed is cast back upon her in every aspect. This is one such reflection. She herself has spoken in similar fashion of other fallen girls, and now she stands in their place. A trace of charity still appears in her words, a charity born of suffering. Yet everything that drove me to the deed was so good, so dear. She feels that devotion to her highest instinct is precisely what has ruined her, yet she fully acknowledges her sin and her guilt. Before the Mater Dolorosa, Margaret now turns to her religion, seeking it to overcome the infinite pain of her violation. She feels utterly alienated from it by her deed. There is no longer any excuse in her own mind. Her appeal is directed to the Virgin, herself with the sword in her heart, who looks up to the Father for help. It is the worship of sorrow, which has elsewhere been described as the highest of the three great forms of religion. The image of the Mother of God, in utter desolation, becomes the image of Margaret's own desolation. Deity itself must suffer thus, and thereby becomes an object of worship. What troubles my poor heart, what it longs for, thou knowest, and thou alone. In this way there remains at least one sympathetic being in the solitary world. The charity of a spirit that also dwells in sorrow becomes her only friend. It is a soul-wrenching yet soul-purifying scene. The poet here reveals the heart of the betrayed and abandoned maiden as she makes her appeal to the highest. "Rescue me from pain and death," she prays to the Virgin, asking to have the consequences of her deed removed. But this cannot be granted. She is to be made clean, yet not in that way. The divine order cannot be overturned on her behalf, though her anguish makes her believe it might be. Her final cry remains a prayer, "Thou sorrow-rich, bend thy look mercifully on my sorrow." But she must pass through this suffering, and in that passage lies her redemption. Such is the strong petition of Margaret. Between it and its answer is inserted the episode of the death of Valentine, her brother. The clear purpose of this scene is to complete the destruction of the family in all its relations, and thereby to show the entire sweep of Faust's act in its domestic phase. That denial of his, followed through in deed, means the death of every member of the family, and thus negation is shown in one of its practical consequences. The brother, a soldier, has heard of the disgrace of his sister. It has been spread among his fellow soldiers, whose mockery he must endure. Yet if I should trounce them all together, I could not call them liars. At that moment he sees two men approaching before Margaret's door. They are Faust and Mephisto, the one still burdened with his usual qualms of conscience, night in his bosom, the other scoffing at his companion and declaring that he feels in his own bosom the thievery and lust of the tomcat by night. Then Mephisto begins to sing a serenade, a moral song the better to fool her. At this point the conflict arises with Valentine, who is struck down by Faust. The brother, seeking to defend or avenge the violated family, falls. He attempts to kill the destroyer by his own hand, and by that same hand he is killed. Whatever feeling may suggest, law and the institutions of the world declare this was not the rightful way to punish Faust's deed. Valentine appeals to private vengeance, and by private vengeance he perishes. He calls down his own fate, Yet more deeply, his destiny lies within that first denial of Faust, which is to sweep away not only the family in all its relations, but the entire spiritual heritage of humanity. Valentine, stepping forth to avenge by violence the negation born of intellect, is easily crushed. On his deathbed, he utters a prophecy concerning Margaret's future in the harshest logic, first in secret with the one, then a dozen, then the whole city. The result is the perverted family, into which Faust's deed transforms the true family, or what remains of it. That draught in his body, taken from the witch's kitchen, now turns the world toward its own distorted reality, toward perversion. This scene has often been criticized as interrupting the pure movement of the action, as lacking adequate motive, and as containing improbabilities and inconsistencies. It is known to have been written considerably later than the scenes between which it is placed, and it does not possess the same pure poetic flow, nor the inevitable succession of thought, word, and deed that characterizes those parts. It is not equal in power, yet it completes the movement, and also serves as both relief and preparation for the final, fully intensified scene of the present part of the Margaret drama. The scene now returns to the cathedral with its service, organ, and song. It stands as the final scene for the present, placed at the same location where the first scene of the Margaret drama occurred, but now with a worldwide difference in Margaret herself, the difference between innocence and guilt. Formerly she came forth half play, half God in her heart, but now the first cry is, how otherwise? She has met Faust, the man with denial within him, and her world is destroyed. Two spirits speak to her. One is an inner voice, that of conscience, here called an evil spirit. It may seem strange that the gnawings of conscience are represented as the work of Satan, yet such is the truth. The tempter and the punisher are both the devil, according to popular conception. The one who obeys him does not receive favor, but punishment. In proportion to devotion to Satan comes Satan's torture. Thus the evil spirit reproaching Margaret, now called conscience or remorse, is the same evil spirit that led her into sin. Both sides belong together, two sides of one thing. The evil deed brings its own punishment according to its degree. Evil is self-punitive and finally self-destructive. Evil seeking to annihilate itself is the underlying thought. Satan punishes Satan for his own wickedness. The poet, therefore, together with theology and mythology, represents the evil spirit as reproaching evil. The burden of this reproach is dreadful, nothing less than the destruction of the entire family through her act. Her mother's soul, which through her slept over to long, long pain in purgatory, her brother's blood, the new life stirring under her heart, these are the accusations. Her cry is, "Oh, were I rid of the thoughts," for the words of the evil spirit are identical with her own thoughts. This is the inner torment, expressed through the whisperings of the evil spirit. But then another voice is heard, joined to the most terrible music, the voice of priest, organ, and choir proclaiming the day of wrath, when the whole secular world becomes one burning mass, and all shall burn except the Holy Church. What comfort is there in this song for Margaret with her faith? It is the answer of her religion to her prayer. In the previous scene she had made her desperate appeal for rescue, asking her church to bridge the gulf that separated her from its arms. Now this is the answer, the day of wrath. The evil spirit continues this response in almost the same language as the Latin hymn, itself filled with images of the burning world of divine wrath. The last judgment is portrayed. The trumpet sounds, the graves open, and her heart rises from its ashes to fiery qualms. Then the choir continues, echoing the evil spirit in the language of the church. Nothing will remain unavenged. Thus the two voices, the evil and the ecclesiastical, speak the same message to the terrified soul, overwhelmed with guilt and shame, only that one speaks German, the language of daily life, while the other speaks Latin, the language of the Church. This is a conception true in its essence, though often mocked. The devil is, in a certain sense, the Church's instrument, though at times he makes the Church his instrument. Here he is punishing guilt, that is, his own deed, and the Church joins in, seeing the devil tormenting the devil. This becomes the only path of salvation for Margaret. Her guilt must be consumed in its own fire. Had the Church been shown as inspiring her guilt rather than punishing it, it might rightly be called the devil's instrument. But the church had been her protection. When she fled from it to Martha's house, she became exposed to Satan. In universal terms, evil is the instrument through which both the individual and humanity rise above their weaknesses and limitations into a higher universal life. These thoughts, though not immediately present in this scene, are necessary for its true comprehension, a comprehension not merely of the thing itself, but also around it and above it, so that the world in which it moves becomes visible. The scene touches deeply the religious parallel to the Faust problem, the question of the negative and its function in man and in the world. Here this is given in ecclesiastical forms for that simple girl who lives entirely within the world of the church. She, too, is undergoing in her own way the Faust experience, and is truly the female counterpart of her lover. The three fundamental principles of the spiritual universe appear in this scene, interwoven in a strange and terrible harmony, sounding like the crack of doom. God, devil, and man, brought before us on earth as the church, the evil spirit, and Margaret. Hell and heaven, the nether and upper worlds, grind against each other, with a poor mortal caught between them, crashing together within her soul. The structure is to be observed. The voice of each is heard 4 times, echoing through the scene as through the world's cathedral: the Latin anthem of God, the German curse of the devil, and the despairing wail of the sinner. Yet all 3 finally utter the same thing, the word of the last judgment to the guilty soul. Both the church and the evil spirit, otherwise supreme enemies, turn upon Margaret, and she turns upon herself. The 2 millstones of the universe crush her more and more toward nothingness, until she sinks into a swoon, into that unconscious lethe which begins to wash away her stains. But the answer of her church to her supplication is this: she cannot be rescued from shame and death without passing through them. This is her inferno that must burn her pure. After that, all remains to be seen. Looking back over the Margaret story, its organic place within the total Faust drama becomes clear. Faust, with his negative intellect and rejuvenated sensuous nature, enters the pure domestic institution, perverts it, and destroys it in the person of Margaret, together with her entire family. This is the present outcome of that universal no heard in the first soliloquy, which begins to invade the realm of institutions. The man becomes a devouring force, not of the material world, but of the spiritual world of his race. The theme of the poem thus unfolds in its full scope and strict necessity. The Margaret drama is not an incidental episode, as is often said, but a logical requirement of the poem's subject. In the Faust books no such story as that of Margaret is found. Indeed, its Catholic setting would be inconsistent with their rigid Protestant tone. Still, certain faint traces may be noted. The compact with the devil, according to Widman's Faust book, stated that Faust should not enter the marriage relation, probably a Protestant thrust against monks and priests. It is further said that, because of this contract, he was forced to give up a Württemberg peasant girl, Landmädchen, whom he wished to marry. Loper calls this the foundation of the Margaret scenes, though this remains doubtful. The whole development is drawn from Goethe's own experience with Lily, with Frederick, and especially with Margaret of Frankfurt, whose shadowy figure appears so delicately in Goethe's autobiography. Again we are carried by a sudden leap into a wild romantic world of witchery, where the mind is dazed by strange and rapid change. Faust, after his perverted career with Margaret, passes into a new perversion. He is at once whirled into a supernatural realm of ghostly forms and uncanny scenery. The question arises, what does this transition mean? Some explain it as contrast, and certainly the contrast is strong. The preceding cathedral scene, with its worship of God and the voice of his last judgment upon the sinful believer, now shifts into a hell on earth, where mocking fiends celebrate diabolic rites, and Faust, the disbeliever, moves in company with the devil. This is indeed sharp contrast. Yet contrast alone is an empty criterion, since it does not reveal the inner necessity of the scene. The true explanation must be sought in the unfolding of the theme. Walpurgis Night carries the vision back beyond Christendom into the primeval religion of the Teutonic race, when the old gods became devils and evil spirits within the new faith. Ancient worshippers were accustomed to celebrate the night preceding the 1st of May. Their priests lit sacred fires upon mountain summits, and the Blocksberg or Brocken was one of these mountains, preserved through ages with its summit wrapped in legend. To the Christian imagination, These heathen rites became transformed into magic and the work of evil powers. The gathering was turned into an assembly of witches and devils, and Walpurgis Night became known as the Witches' Sabbath. The name is taken from Saint Walpurga, a woman saint of the 8th century, who otherwise has no connection with the event except that it falls upon her day in the saint's calendar. Walpurgis Night is not found connected with the Faust legend in older books or traditions. Nevertheless, it bears the same character, since it presents a world of devils opposed to Christendom. This underlying spirit led the poet to unite the two traditions into one vast Teutonic myth. Even earlier, however, Johann Friedrich Loewen, in a comic epic published in the 18th century, had invoked Faust as a famous spirit who provides material for his song. In another passage, Faust is placed at the left hand of Beelzebub on the Blocksberg and sings a drinking song amid applause of assembled spirits. Such is the grotesque outline of the struggle between old and new gods in the Teutonic imagination. The old gods, though overthrown, still exist as a negative world, active in darkness and opposed to the realm of light and goodness. It is the ancient dualism, already present as the germ of the Faust myth and indeed of mythology itself, now rising again in fantastic shapes from the summit of the Blocksberg. At once the kinship between this scene and that of the witch's kitchen becomes evident. The two are related yet distinct. Each expresses a phase of the perverted world, though in different forms. In both, the literary form itself is distorted in harmony with the subject. The expression appears as nonsense, while the content is sense, producing a separation between meaning and form that violates ordinary literary expectation. Yet within this apparent disorder lies the essence of the poetic method. There is method in this madness, a kind of Hamlet-like problem in which reason expresses itself through apparent unreason. This is the difficulty now confronting the reader. He must perceive reason shining through this wilderness of unreason, and even hold both contradictory sides together as one. A new task is thus required of the reader of such poetry. One might almost say a new capacity of reading is demanded to enter its spirit. It is not enough merely to understand. The scene must be recreated in the mind. There is no meaning in it unless its strange mystery impels the reader to remake it inwardly. The forms are present, but hollow and even absurd, until they are filled with content by the reader's own activity. The mind must shape itself into the vessel provided by the poet. He demands not a passive or merely receptive reader, but a creative one, who takes part in the making of the poem itself. A final interpretation for everybody is therefore not to be expected, and indeed is rather to be avoided, as contrary to the spirit of this kind of writing. The interpreter is only to spur the flagging and possibly discouraged reader, and to help him form his own interpretation. A strict meaning for each verse cannot be fixed so as to exclude other meanings and applications. This is the essential character of the scene. Intended, it is thought, by the author. The reader must be present himself, with imagination active, and fill out these forms with his own meaning. Reading creatively is the only method here, a new way of reading, whereby the poet selects his reader for all time and takes him into poetic partnership. The poet does not offer verses merely to amuse, to pass time, or even simply to instruct. It is his suggestions that must be clarified, his indefiniteness made definite through the reader's own thought. Like Providence, he furnishes a poetic world in which the reader may act in freedom, and yet still carry out a providential purpose. The very essence of this strange poetic form is that in its details it can be filled out in various ways. For example, those washers who are always washing yet remain sterile can be placed into many, indeed all, phases of life. The image must be translated into one's own experience. One reader may think of one thing, another of something else, and both be right. The form is large enough for everybody. Others besides Goethe have written such sentences, but have not raised them into a literary whole in which they all belong together and form a new art form, unintelligible unless the reader rises to the act of creating what he reads. Still, the interpreter has his small function even here in these details. He can show his way and thus help others find theirs. His experience of life differs from that of the reader, but the reader's own experience must be put into these forms, which are meant to suggest what is nearest and most vital to him. For this Walpurgis Night is not simply an allegory, or parable, or string of symbols, or a riddle, unless one makes it so. Then it becomes any or all of these. It may be a riddle to one reader, but in itself it is not. It is a genuine expression of something that can be expressed adequately only in this way, a true literary form, strange only because it is so new in literature. It may seem as unnatural to the modern critical mind as Shakespeare's Hamlet once seemed to Voltaire, yet this form will be appropriated and become part of literary consciousness as completely as Hamlet, to which it bears analogy in certain points. But while the details are manifold and open to several explanations, the general plan is one and necessary. Over this world of capricious and shifting forms stands poetic providence, whose single purpose is to permit and carry out such fantastic freedom. To unfold this overarching scheme, which gives unity and reveals both what the scene is in itself and its place in the whole poem, is the chief duty of the helper, or literary priest, who feels called to interpret the Bibles of literature. What then does the whole represent? It shows a vast gathering of people, a world of strivers, engaged in a race up a mountain. Each seeks his own end, and that end toward which all strive is the summit of Brocken, or some place within its valleys. On the height toward which the grand ascent leads, her Urian sits, representing the fulfillment of their striving. Two strong lines run through and bind the thought together. The whirlpool strives to get above. While you are shoved, you think you shove. Each individual works with all his strength toward his own end. He believes it is free will that acts, and in a sense it is. Yet this free will has its ground in a deeper necessity. He could not reach his object without a world order around and above him, which not only incites but compels him to act. Enveloping the inner voice, I will, are greater ocean tones commanding, thou must. The truth is clear, thou art shoved, but by what? That is the important question. Having discovered it, one must bring oneself into harmony with it, and not resist the world order, which is not to be confused, but only oneself thrown into disorder. Manifestly, a world of individual ends is here brought before us. The question arises whether this can be identified with any existing reality, for no part of Goethe's work can be fully accepted until one has seen in it the image of some great fact. Certain writers have been content to regard this Walpurgis Night as an integral part of the grand Faust myth, at least in conception, if not in historical origin. It is said that as the poet introduced the Lord with the heavenly hosts, so the infernal counterpart must also be added for completeness. The devil must likewise be shown in his own realm among his vassals, as a travesty of divine order and Christian worship. Yet even if this is granted, the deeper question remains. To what reality does this imaginative construction correspond? Of what fact is this legend the image, or must the legend itself be accepted as fact without further inquiry? Long familiarity with the poet's method makes it necessary to affirm that even in his wildest invention he has before him some spiritual reality, which he seeks to draw from obscurity and give poetic life, and only when that underlying fact is recognized can he be understood. From this standpoint, the poet has in mind the phenomenon of civil society, of which he seeks to present an inverted image in this legend of Walpurgis Night. The nature of this appearance, and its position within the poem and Faust's development at this stage, must be explained. Society, in this sense, is an immense complex of private pursuits in which each individual follows his own end. Each is, as it were, striving toward the summit of Brocken. He seeks to satisfy his needs, to gain power, money, fame, or whatever defines his individual aim. Yet before he can receive, he must give. He cannot obtain even a piece of bread without recognizing the baker, the miller, the farmer, all of whom have already pursued their own ends, and in doing so have contributed that bread for him and for others. Thus, although each man seeks for himself, he cannot acquire unless he offers to the rest of mankind an equivalent. He participates in the gifts of society only insofar as he contributes to the totality. Society may therefore be called an immense bank that cashes the efforts of every individual. Each pursues his own end in the expectation that society will and must repay him. If such a bank did not exist, man would be reduced to the condition of the animal, gathering food directly from field and forest without recognizing any common end in others. It is this social bank, honoring the labor check of every worker, that may be regarded as the foundation of civilization. In this way, each individual, being compelled to deposit in the universal bank before he can draw from it, is lifted beyond a purely selfish life of rapine. A power stands over him, restraining him, as it were, from becoming wholly bestial. It will not allow him to consume until he has earned, that is, until he has contributed to the common store. Even if he is not conscious of this, even if he believes he is acting solely for his own purposes, he is in fact serving the universal order by giving before he takes. Through this process, man is trained into an ethical existence and acquires honesty, which is the impulse to give fair value for what is received. To cheat is to pursue pure selfishness, and to violate the social bank by withdrawing what has not been deposited. Society therefore has two aspects, as other institutions do: the individual and the universal. The one is the selfish element. The other is the rational element, which compels selfishness to overcome itself and contribute to the whole in order to preserve itself at all. Yet this rational element may be denied. One may conclude that only the individual end is real and that no universal principle governs it. Such is Faust, under the influence of denial guided by Mephisto. For him, the universal power over man becomes an illusion. Society is reduced to a carnival of selfishness, a brocken where individual ends alone prevail. In such a realm, all destructive forces of appetite and passion operate without restraint. Order, harmony, and rationality are eliminated, leaving only the broken world. Mephisto's social realm is precisely this, another phase of the perverted world, and the third such manifestation already observed. We may now observe the inherent connection of this scene with the preceding one. The family rests on two principles, and society likewise has its two principles. As Faust denies the rational principle of the family, so he also denies that of society. Yet he still reveals that aspiration remains within him, just as he once saw, in the lowest depths of the perverted family, a vision of the ideal, so now he beholds Margaret and feels her eternal love even in the dregs of this perverted society. The extreme point of his negative conduct becomes at the same time the point where reaction and return begin. Society itself grows out of the family. It is the next higher ethical institution, standing between family and state. Faust has already perverted the family. His next step, in ascending order, is to pervert that larger aggregate of families called society, which he accomplishes logically through the denial of its rational element. As in earlier cases, Mephisto has preceded him in the world and constructed a perverted society into which Faust is led. This perverted society exists as a reality. Can the reader not recognize it? One need not name a single individual, but a whole community or city entirely surrendered to wild money-getting and wild money-spending, both being two sides of the same selfish pursuit. One hears the bustle, sees the rushing crowd through the streets, but one must keep safely out of their path, lest one be trampled down. The faces of men in feverish activity reveal their purpose, and one may ask, who are they, where are they going, what do they seek? The poet answers, it is the throng of evil spirits in the night of Walpurgis, gathered for their great celebration on the witches' Sabbath, hurrying up the slopes of Brocken toward the summit where her Urian is to be attained. Each thinks he shoves, but he is shoved. This line expresses the theory of Brocken. Each individual pursues his private object, which is in one form or another to gain control of the universal bank, yet that very bank controls him and makes his pursuit possible. Represented here as witches and wizards, he appears as a comic and distorted figure. His effort is self-negating, for the realization of his aim would also destroy it. The true man in society, however, strengthens the bank rather than diverting it into private channels. He recognizes its universality and acts in harmony with it, and as an ethical being he pursues ethical ends, domestic, social, and political, as the highest. This vast bank of society, which first binds every individual to labor and then cashes his labor draft, is a remarkable structure, indeed the chief structure of modern civilization. Though not perfect, it advances toward perfection, giving ever more nearly to the worker his just reward and to the idle their proper equivalent. Many have attempted, and still attempt, to seize this bank and reconstruct it. The theorist wishes to subject it to his system, the anarchist to destroy it, the communist to appropriate its resources for public use. But it refuses individual control, which would mean its destruction. It moves in its own orbit according to its own law, like the sun, which does not yet shine by human regulation. Even the American assailant of the bank is not explicitly named, yet he may be understood here. He attempts to seize the bank and redirect its universal flow of wealth into his private channel. He ruins railroads, locks up produce, speculates in securities, and inflates stock, methods of drawing immense gain from the bank without contributing to it, and of taking from others who have contributed. Thus he spends his life trying to turn the universal stream of money into individual possession, weakening the bank and undermining its ability to repay its rightful creditors. He is the burglar of society's bank, the great criminal who, in spite of everything, is not yet caught. Faust, however, is the theoretical speculator rather than the practical one of the stock exchange, concerned less with action than with philosophical denial. He enters society with his no, accompanied by Mephisto. At once the universal element falls away, and the image of Walpurgis Night appears, showing what society becomes under denial of its rational principle. Now the harmony of this strange literary form becomes clear, as chosen by the poet for the subject at hand. Indeed, the theme could take no other form than this distorted one, for it is meant to represent perverted society. There is sense within nonsense, as Goethe himself suggests in Conversation. The rational element of society is ignored in individual pursuit. Likewise, the rational element of literary form is ignored in its representation. Yet reason lies precisely within this unreason. The outer form is irrational, but the inner controlling power remains rational. Wisdom here employs folly as its instrument. Thus Walpurgis Night is not a poetic caprice. It belongs to the deepest necessity of the poem, standing exactly where it must stand and nowhere else, its fantastic shape being simply the theme clothing itself in its own natural form. Faust and Mephisto are now to pass through this strange realm and behold it in its essential phases. Following them, three capital points in the structure become visible. First is the general movement of the multitude upwards, seeking the summit of the mountain, the great world of Brocken. Secondly is the movement sidewards, or contrarywards, toward covert places, the little worlds of Brocken. Thirdly is Faust's vision of Margaret on Brocken, the ideal rising within this perverted society, at which point the latter begins to fade. These three phases must now be unfolded, with a reminder that the details admit of various fillings, and that the reader must pour his own meaning and experience into these forms if he is to enter fully into the spirit of the scene. First is the movement upwards, in which each person seeks his special end, while the whole mass advances toward its own end. The differing dispositions of the two travellers are immediately seen. Faust is delighted with nature in her springtime aspect and does not care for the repulsive instruments of witchery. Mephisto, however, desires the very coarsest goat, and declares that it is still winter in my body. There is no sun over this festival, only a dim belated moon. Therefore the travellers must rely on the unsteady will o' the wisp or air light, born of mire and darkness. By such a light this witch world is to be seen, a fickle illumination, regarded in northern myth as a misleading demon, always suggesting the inner flickering whims of individual impulse without rational purpose. In this ascent, a sequence of pictures unfolds like a panorama. The outer scenery of this witch world is described in alternating song by the three voices. It is a magic realm where trees run after trees, as a child once said while watching a fast-moving train and seeing the forest appear to run. Cliffs nod to cliffs, and the long peak noses of the mountains are snoring. Nature itself becomes distorted under the airlight, and the mountain is magic mad today. Yet Faust, in his aspiration, hears songs of love and hope announcing the new season. Mephisto, by contrast, finds only diabolic signs: ominous birds, monsters in tree roots, swarms of fireflies acting as misleading guides. Finally, the central question arises: are they moving or standing still? Everything seems in whirl. Trees and cliffs turn into ghosts and make strange gestures at the confused travellers. Nature, the sublime setting of Brocken, is thus perverted in the airlight, and this single airlight becomes many. The result is that outer sense, uncorrected by reason, loses all certainty. One no longer knows whether movement exists at all. The earth itself appears motionless while the great light circles it above. Remove rational judgment from perception of nature, and she too becomes a physical Brocken, part of this Walpurgis night. At the next stage, the travellers reach a midpoint height and behold, with astonishment, Mammon glowing in the mountain. A play of steam, fire, and smoke spreads over the slopes into the depths. It suggests industry extracting wealth from the earth. Nature, first seen in her simple form, is transformed into wealth, the object of individual pursuit. From this process sparks fly like scattered gold. Yet wealth also appears in another form. The entire rocky wall of Brocken, up to its summit, becomes a brilliant palace, the palace of Mammon, built from the gold he gathers. Luxury and extravagance follow riches. Society rushes after them. One can hear the boisterous guests of Brocken approaching. The storm strikes the traveller, the old foundations tremble, and the established order of society cracks under the pursuit of material gain. Revolution sounds within the tumult of selfish passion. All are drawn toward the palace of Mammon and its grand illumination, yet they pass it, for it stands only midway up the mountain. Wealth proves to be only an intermediate goal for most of the crowd. They continue to rush upward, and this forms the third picture, the great witch procession toward the summit of Brocken. A vast struggle is now shown toward the elevated seat of her Urian, who may be taken as the fulfillment of each one's highest individual endeavor. This endeavor is not a universal end, but a special or selfish one. It appears in many forms, yet all are alike in that each pursues his own special end. The present wild ferment cannot be fixed as meaning one definite thing alone, for example a single literary period or movement and nothing beyond it. The forms remain too general for such narrow identification. Within this scene several smaller groups appear, and these may be observed separately. First is old Borbo, mounted on a mother swine and leading the procession, clearly representing the material needs and greeds of life which the multitude seeks to satisfy. The owl is disturbed by the uproar. The crowd is so dense that no one considers another. One is flayed, others are struck by forks or scratched by brooms of those riding. The child is stifled, the mother bursts. In this intensity of selfish pursuit there is little humanity, no love, no help for the neighbor. In the crowded streets of a great city, the traveller may meet the same fate. Business is business. There is no charity, only competition. The mutual abuse of wizards and witches reveals the truth of each other in this mad race toward the house of the evil one. Each individual, pursuing individual ends, disregards the rest. Every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. That is Brocken, where even the foremost is moving toward the devil and will soon be there. Yet there are those who require help to ascend this mountain. 3 such persons, or types, are heard calling for assistance, but the throng responds with refusal in a selfish and savage witch chorus. Those of the rocky sea desire to rise but cannot. Though constantly active, no fruit comes from their labor. We wash and are clean as clean can be, but also eternally sterile. They represent the formalists who scrub the surface while neglecting the essential. Not only critics, but many in every class and profession are of this kind, eternally washing, yet eternally sterile, clean in appearance but without result. Even their individual end is not reached. Another voice comes from the rocky cleft, where, like the rocky sea, beings seem imprisoned in stone. Take me along, I have been climbing 300 years and cannot reach the top. The identity is clear, and there is no need to name it further. The witch chorus answers harshly. Everything is ready. Broom, fork, stick, goat. Who does not rise today is lost. Yet such a one will likely never leave his cleft, climbing endlessly without a rival. A third figure is the half-witch, lagging behind, divided in herself. At home I have no peace, and here I attain not. The chorus urges her to become whole. Use any means, seize anything for the end. Who does not fly today will never fly. Thus these 3 remain behind in the race. But what awaits the throng at the summit? The double chorus declares that they will descend again to the plane and spread over it as a swarm of witchdom. The attainment of individual ends is not final. It does not keep one upon the height, for descent and repetition follow. Only the universal end can bring peace, for it includes all and is the end of ends. The witch world pours down again into the heath to begin another ascent of Brocken. Thus appears the complete circle of Brocken, upward and downward in an endless movement, the ceaseless tread of men. The movement now turns sidewards, through which the travellers are to observe the little worlds of Brocken. Mephisto refuses to go to the summit with the crowd, declaring that it is too mad even for me. He would likely become separated from Faust and risk losing him at the very point where individualism reaches its highest extreme. Already they are divided and must be called back together. Mephisto might even find himself confronted by her Urian, who sits on the summit and is here named the Evil One. In such a case, what advantage would there be in ascending at all? Faust, if he should reach the summit and behold the final expression of evil, might recognize its self-destroying nature and witness the negation of the negation. Many riddles, indeed his chief one, could find their solution there. But the devil dissuades him, enticing instead with sensuous attractions and the promise of witches young and naked. The little worlds are scattered throughout the greater world of Brocken. Hundreds of fires are burning, each isolated, and they pass from fire to fire. Everywhere Mephisto is recognized as master of the house by that sign, the cloven foot. Accordingly, they turn aside to explore the countercurrents within this great stream on Brocken countercurrents, yet still part of the same stream. Here appears opposition to the selfish pursuit of the great multitude, yet this opposition is itself selfish, and therefore still belongs to Brocken, being composed of those who are hostile to selfishness through selfishness. Three separate scenes are observed through the traveller's gaze. First, the snail, symbol of backwardness and conservatism, with its face of feelers, introduces this little world, just as Borbo and her swine led the larger procession upward. 4 old men sit around dying embers, withdrawn from the great press of the crowd. When asked why they withdrew, each gives a purely personal reason. They are grumblers, discontented, reactionary figures. Yet in their withdrawal they still pursue individual ends without regard to the universal interest. Their complaint is that their selfishness is no longer successful. In essence they remain the same as the great throng they condemn. Mephisto mocks them with biting scorn, repeating their spirit in parody. Because my wine runs turbid, the world must be at its dregs. These are 4 types of unappreciated figures, found everywhere and not limited to age. There is truth in their complaint, yet they themselves embody what they denounce. This is especially evident in the writer without readers, whose lament, "Who now reads a good book?" echoes through time, not as a universal truth, but as his own condition. These old men look back to the time when they were still within the mainstream, calling it the Golden Age. They long for a past in which their selfishness prospered. That past appears again in the Brocken historian, who is in truth the huckster witch. Not the muse of history, but the witch of history. She has assembled a shop full of curiosities, such as cannot be found on the earth. Nothing on her shelves is without harm to mankind. No dagger that has not spilled blood, no cup that has not given poison, no jewel that has not betrayed a woman. Scholars have traced her name in detail, yet it matters little. She is better understood by viewing similar collections elsewhere, where history itself becomes an infernal museum of curiosities. She is also to be connected with the preceding group of old men, who belong naturally within her shop of antiquities. Yet a strange fact emerges. The devil wants nothing to do with his own past. Mephisto dismisses the witch's careful collection with contempt. As always, the evil one does not value his former servants, for he torments them in proportion to their devotion and ultimately destroys them. He seeks only living people in the present. Only novelties attract us. Despite these smaller eddies, the whole whirlpool still strives upward. The little worlds are as selfish as the great world, each seeking to get on top, which is to say, to reach the top of Brocken itself. Thereupon another female figure appears, not the one who preserves past curiosities of the devil, but one who offers present pleasures of his. Lilith, Adam's first wife by name, the original woman who awakens desire and establishes the first perverted family, now comes into view. She stands in sharp contrast to Eve, the second wife and mother of the human family, who is the consort not of passion but of the reason of mankind. This Lilith has devils nestling in her hair, in which especially young men become entangled. She is the outcast of society, and therefore not found in the great stream, but still occupies a hidden corner of Brocken. She appears as a distant figure of ancient Hebrew tradition, already woven into the myth of Walpurgis Night before Goethe's treatment. The witch's kitchen briefly reappears in the background, with the old and young witch acting as partners of Mephisto and Faust. It belongs to the total social whole and must be included. With a single glance it passes on in its sensual revel. But who is this rushing in with a curse? He is the enemy of Brocken within Brocken, the bitterest foe of ghosts, and yet in that very opposition their servant. In him the counter-movement of these little worlds reaches its peak. It is not impulse or passion that brings him here, but the cold intellect, which denies the universal or spiritual end and elevates individual pursuit into a system of thought. He appears as the philosopher of Brocken, seemingly linked with Lilith, because he has prostituted not his body but his mind. As philosopher, he denies the spiritual world, yet this denial becomes itself a spirit that haunts him and drives him toward Brocken. The individual traits of this figure have been identified beyond doubt as those of Nikolai, Goethe's major literary adversary. He represents the supreme Philistin, who perceives no universal or spiritual end and attempts to dismiss it as superstition. In this sense he belongs to Brocken, though he is hostile to the spirits there. His opposition, in its very intensity, turns into participation. An episode from his life becomes a striking image for his character. As an opponent of spirits, he was troubled by visions of spirits and was cured through the medical application of leeches. Yet he could not remain silent about it. Instead, he must blab every step. He committed the folly of writing an essay that describes in full detail his illness and its cure, and of reading it before the Berlin Academy of Sciences. In doing so, he exposed himself before the entire German public and, of his own accord, wove himself into the myth of Brocken, where he was given a lasting place. It is the most personal portrait within Brocken, and therefore less fitting, and despite its sharp satire, less satisfactory, since it deals too closely with individual personality. One is led to think that the poet might have followed more closely his own principle, that the individual matter should be raised to its universal meaning. Faust has withdrawn from the young witch of his own accord. He saw a red mouse spring out of her mouth, a sign that danger is present. Mephisto answers this with a scoffing laugh, trying to dismiss his concern. Do not be so finical, the mouse was not grey, since a literal grey mouse would indeed be the real miracle under such circumstances. Yet Faust perceives more than this single image. Behold yonder a pale fair child alone and distant. It is like Margaret. In the very extremity of sensual excess, the ideal rises again, just as it previously appeared in the witch's kitchen. Aspiration returns at the final limit of negation, and a new resolve is born from satiety and disgust. Over this confusion of selfishness and sensuality, the image of Margaret hovers with her sacrifice. At her presence, Brocken begins to fade into the image of love and devotion, for the witch world cannot endure such a vision within it. Mephisto attempts to suppress this movement, hostile to his rule, calling the sacred image an idol, a deceptive magical apparition, even a Medusa whose gaze turns men to stone. Still Faust is not restrained. A deeper element of his nature, conscience or sense of guilt, begins to stir and raises visions before him. He sees the fate of Margaret on Brocken, a single scarlet band around her fair neck, no broader than a knife blade. This appears as a prophetic image of the judgment that awaits her, which he will later strive passionately to avert. From surviving fragments of the original plan, it seems the poet intended to develop this judgment scene as a bloody, phantasmagoric vision on Brocken, though a later and more restrained conception prevented its execution. Mephisto then seeks to divert Faust's attention and produces a theatrical counter-dream. This becomes the Walpurgis Night's dream, a new piece, the last of 7, entirely fragmented, a drama composed according to the theatrical maxim of the manager in the prelude, "If ye give a piece, give it in pieces." It is therefore no surprise that a dilettante wrote it, and dilettanti play it too. Such patchwork dilettantism was disliked by Goethe, since it destroys the unity that true art seeks. He even planned a work against dilettantism, and its outlines remain in his collected writings. He places the dilettanti upon Brocken, where they belong, since they pursue only individual ends, money, fame, honor, or caprice, without grasping a spiritual whole. Their work exists for themselves, not for its own artistic necessity. The 7th piece is named as though 6 others preceded it, and the poet, adopting the perspective of a dilettante, can easily divide his Brocken panorama into 6 scenes. Mephisto thus presents to Faust an intellectual Brocken of literature, since the social Brocken in all its forms has failed to satisfy him, and has instead called forth from its sensual depths the pure image of self-sacrificing love, Margaret, from whom these empty fireworks of intellect seek to distract the struggler's aspiration. The theme of Walpurgis Night engaged Goethe at various stages of his life. He ascended the Brocken several times, first in the late 18th century, and the ascent inspired his well-known poem Harzreise im Winter. The mountain's wild landscape deeply impressed his imagination, as did the mythology linked with ancient Teutonic tradition. Another poem, the first Walpurgis Night, arises from the same setting and expresses the conflict between the old heathen religion and the emerging Christian faith. One can picture the poet climbing the mountain, observing its shifting scenery, and inwardly witnessing the rise of a mythical world of spirits with which the primitive imagination has crowned its summit. In this way, Brocken and its mythic content are carried into the Faust drama, which seeks to encompass the broader mythic world of Teutonic tradition. Thus the poet gathers and organizes the scattered mythic elements of his people into a unified poetic cosmos. Faust's journey to the Brocken on Walpurgis Night is presented as a dark, infernal undertaking, coming closest in the poem to a descent into hell. The older Faust tradition had already imagined Faust going down alive into the infernal regions and returning again, a pattern that parallels the stories of Ulysses in the Odyssey and Aeneas in Virgil, both heroic figures who must pass beyond the limits of life and come back bearing knowledge or message for their people. The example of Dante is especially suggested in this context. In this sense, Faust is likewise meant to see and pass through an inferno, accompanied by Mephistopheles. Yet the poet does not use the classical myth in its direct form, but instead works through the Teutonic mythic world. At one stage there had even been a plan for Faust to descend into the Greek Hades and plead with Persephonia, queen of the underworld, for the release of Helen's shade. This idea was intended for a classical Walpurgis Night in the second part, but it was never fully carried out. Instead, the repeated ascents to the Brocken became a source of mythic imagery that remained with the poet throughout his life, later transforming in unexpected ways into his vision of the Hellenic world. In the present scene, however, the setting is not the Christian hell or the Greek Hades, but rather the night side of the Teutonic mythos. Through this framework, the poet expresses the deeper Teutonic experience embodied in Faust. The scene, often condemned by critics as an unnecessary excrescence, was regarded by the poet himself as an essential component of the work. It was not originally designed for its present position in Faust, but intended for Schiller's periodical, the Musenalmanach. Its main composition belongs to the year 1797, thus preceding the earlier Walpurgis Night seen by several years. According to the poet's own implication, the piece gradually developed in his mind until it took on the character of a phase within the poem, and especially a phase connected with Brocken. That Goethe knew when and how to apply the pruning knife to his own productions is shown in the Paralipomena to Faust, where the Brocken material, in particular, appears considerably reduced, as surviving fragments demonstrate. It may therefore be concluded without hesitation that he considered this scene to stand in its proper place, even though he refers to it as an intermezzo, a term taken from Italian drama and meaning something inserted between larger parts. The piece may seem loosely attached to the poem, Yet the judgment of the poet, as the person most qualified, deserves respectful attention. The task is therefore to discover its structural principle and the linking idea that connects it with what precedes and follows, rather than to reject it according to external standards. The essential concern is to understand how the poet himself views his work and organizes it into a unified whole. Since the lively scene in Auerbach's Cellar, Mephisto has guided Faust through successive stages of the perverted world, the last of which was social Brocken, or perverted society. To this is now added literary Brocken, the intellectual extreme of distortion, where writers, who should present both personal completeness and the truth in its wholeness, instead produce fragmented, partial, and distorted images of it in their works and characters. Brocken thus comes to reflect itself, and that reflection itself is perverted. Goethe, under the disguise of Sir Vibilis, remarks that it was written by a dilettante, a new piece broken into many small fragments, short epigrammatic pieces, each like a polished pebble with its own inscription. It is therefore atomic poetry, yet these separate atoms are held together within a single whole and made to function under a common form and heading, their mutual separation becoming at the same time a principle of unity. Even the characters performing the piece are dilettanti. They too share a common classification, while each acts in a self-contained and individual manner. It becomes clear that this epigrammatic style, as a variation of Brocken's music, arises directly from the theme itself. The poet employs a dilettante form in order to overcome dilettantism. It therefore belongs decisively to Mephisto's realm. These epigrams appear like small devils tormenting minor offenders with their own faults. The poet even calls them insects with little sharp nippers, and further connects them with the greater devil, since they declare themselves ready to honor Popper Satan worthily. In this way, the epigrams, presented as xenia or hospitable offerings, are placed upon literary Brocken to act as minor avenging spirits against literary sins. In a letter to Schiller, he humorously suggests their diabolic character, expressing the hope that readers in Copenhagen and the cultivated regions of the Baltic will find in the xenia a new argument for the real and undeniable existence of the devil. The subject determines the form. Dilettantism is meant to be consumed in its own infernal fire. These are not the refined elegiac xenia written jointly with Schiller, which once caused great discussion when published in the Musenalmanach, but rather what the poet calls tame xenia, of which this Walpurgis Night's dream forms a collection. The scene is called a dream, perhaps because the confusion of Brocken has become internalized. The representation now turns more upon subjective states than upon external social forms, as in the preceding scene. It is also designated as the golden wedding of Oberon and Titania, suggesting separation and reunion within the family sphere. The framework is taken from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, where Oberon and Titania, the fairy husband and wife, quarrel, separate, and are reunited. Their discord, however, brings a general disorder into nature itself, and this same offspring of evils arises from their dispute and dissension. They are its parents and origin. The present separation of the fairy family does not produce physical evils, but intellectual ones. From this division arise harmful progeny, one-sided, perverted phases of spirit, which spring from the split in fairyland, where each individual within a shared bond goes off by himself. This is the dream image of that condition, which finds a distant and shadowy parallel in the separation of Faust and Margaret. In the procession of the rulers of the fairy world appear two spirits, representatives of spirit, Puck and Ariel, possibly understood as fancy and imagination, or prose, dragging his foot in the dance, and poetry, starting the song. These are shadowy forms hovering over the dream world, appearing at both its beginning and its end. Yet this separation of the fairy couple is not real, but only imagined. Oberon and Titania, now celebrating their happy union in a golden wedding, are only able to conceive the possibility of a breaking of their bonds. If the man and wife cannot get along together, send one to the south, the other to the North Pole. Titania expresses this thought, and immediately the orchestra strikes up the loud Brocken music, the fly's snout and the gnat's nose, an insect-like music formed of such epigrams arising from the discordant image of fairyland. This is the outer framework of the scene, which ultimately dissolves again into the sound of the orchestra. A detailed explanation of these small poems is not undertaken here. What is true of Brocken poetry in general is also true of them. They cannot be properly understood, still less enjoyed, unless they are read creatively, their forms filled with the reader's own activity. They are unequal in merit. Some are excellent and might even serve as proverbs. A proverbial character belongs to all of them, a brief, sharp expression that only gains meaning when filled with lived experience. This form of the Xenian, or epigram, first appeared on Brocken during the description of the witch procession's ascent. Here it is continued and forms a small world of its own, still within Brocken. To many readers it first appears as confusion, offering little satisfaction, yet it in fact represents a structured confusion whose purpose must be recognized before any harmony can be drawn from this apparent chaos. In itself one may doubt whether it is worth the effort it demands, but within the total structure of Faust it has its necessary place. Despite its dilettante form, which gives a piece in pieces, a loose structure can still be perceived within the misty, dreamlike scenery. Through the clouds certain groupings become visible. Alongside the prelude and the finale, the musicians repeatedly appear, intervening at certain points with sharp remarks, marking transitions and shifts in the Brocken antiphony. These signals indicate groupings that may be followed, though it must always be remembered that the principle of these verses is atomic, and each unit must first be taken separately in itself. The small rounded elements must be placed into groups, but not too large, or they will scatter again while one is still working with them. The prelude comes first, establishing the theatrical and fairy setting of the scene, until the orchestra of Brocken breaks in with its instruments, fly's snout and gnat's nose, with frog and cricket and all their relations. This is the Brocken music in its full orchestral harmony, from which the individual voices are now to emerge. The second group, in general, satirizes the literary tendencies of the time and presents the condition of belles lettres on Brocken. The small fancies of romanticism, which join delicate incongruities, as a spider's foot and a toad's paunch, and out of them produce, not a little beast, but a little poem, are burlesqued in 3 epigrams. After this come equally misplaced objections to such romantic creations. Oberon, for instance, is mocked as a devil without claws and tail, and the witches are ridiculed because only 2 are powdered. The conclusion becomes a coarse romantic caricature of classical nudity in the young witch, sitting naked on her goat, around whom the poetic swarm is so loud and chaotic that the orchestra leader must intervene to restore order and rhythm. Next appear certain critical tendencies. The weathercock, not the Stolbergs, as correctly noted, that on one side offers only praise and on the other only blame, the Xenia with their nippers, and Hennings, their chief opponent, all belong here together. A further turn gives the group a religious colouring, the stiff man sniffing out Jesuits, the crane fishing in both pure and muddy waters of religion, and the world-child, as Goethe calls himself, with his mockery of those pious circles who form conventicles on Brocken. These remain uncertain and shifting groupings, yet they outline what may be called literary Brocken. The next group is the philosophic, and it is the clearest of all. Indeed, its clarity suggests the principle by which the whole scene may be organized. It is introduced by 3 musical figures, the dancer, the dancing master, and the fiddler, not the jolly fellow, as has been correctly observed, who appear to mock the dull uniformity, the lack of rhythm, and the absence of harmonious style in German philosophical writing. The philosophers, in all their hopping and leaping, never ask how it looks, and they hate one another, while only the drone of the bagpipe unites them. A series of epigrams then follows, aimed at the various one-sided philosophical systems. These are among the best of the group, sharp, clear, and generally meaningful. Yet the skeptic is also present and has the final word. Through doubt, philosophy becomes increasingly discordant and finally dissolves. At this point the leader of the orchestra again intervenes with a fierce exclamation against accursed dilettante, and a new keynote ends philosophic Brocken. The epigrams of the next group, the fourth, have been taken by some as political, but they fit equally well as literary satire and belong to the same context. They show different outer forms of literary activity. First, the versatile ones, always successful with the public, going on their heads when they cannot go on their feet. Then the helpless ones now down, with shoes worn out from dancing. There is also the air-light, the erratic swamp genius, and the meteor, briefly blazing in the sky before lying in the grass. Finally come the massive ones, producing sheer bulk and crushing everything beneath them, the coarse material writing, even when it is called spirit, such as the newspaper. With this, the phase of literary Brocken concludes. The finale consists of the last 3 epigrams, which again recall the tone of the prelude. Puck, though himself rough, reproves these massive elephant calves of literature. Ariel calls upon all you who have wings to follow his airy path up to the Hill of Roses, toward poetry. With this gentle exhortation, the orchestra joins in a soft concord. The Brocken scenery of cloud and mist disappears. The noisy musicians, fly, gnat, frog, and cricket, give way to air in the foliage and wind in the reeds, and the small world fades away in distant music. The perverted society, followed through these 2 sunless scenes, has now dissolved. Brocken, both social and literary, has passed out of Walpurgis Night into daylight. Its final phase shows the mind reflecting itself in its own distortion, beholding its own perverted image. Faust, for whom the entire spectacle has been presented, now sees this image clearly and is brought to full awareness of the realm. It can no longer mislead him, since its nature is revealed. In the next scene he appears deeply disgusted and angered with Mephisto for these insipid distractions, and a new turning point in the drama follows. The poet had at one time considered adding another scene returning to the summit of Brocken and depicting the judgment of Margaret at the court of Satan. However, a better artistic instinct restrained this plan. The mountain world has already been sufficiently revealed, and Faust has fully experienced it. Moreover, Margaret is not to be judged by Satan's court. She is to be shown not as condemned, but as saved.